And first of all, welcome everyone. We do have, this meeting is simultaneously running on Zoom right now. And I believe we have, how many folks are on the Zoom call? 7, okay, plus Barbara. And I think most of those folks are representing our service providers and others. I don't know if we could do a listing of who's out there. Sorry, when we do introductions, but thank you all for giving up a Saturday morning. My name is Kate Angie. I am with Renaissance Planning, and we are the consultant team that's been working with you all to develop this plan. Our primary goal today is to really focus in on kind of where we've been, where are we now, and how do we keep this project moving forward and get you all to a plan. Ultimately, that's what we want to try to accomplish. So before we get started, let's go ahead and do introductions in terms of who's in the room. And I'm going to turn to my left.
Good morning, Craig Mendick, Orange County Planning and Inspections Director.
Great.
Todd Phillips, City of Lebanon, Council. Sally Green, Orange County.
Mike Parker, Chapel Hill Town Council.
Jen Weaver, Hillsborough Mayor.
Wonderful.
Subbing in for my student colleague, Mark Bell.
I'm Travis Mayor,
Great.
Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. Tom Tenite, Planning and Inspections, Orange County. I'm here to run some computers and make sure everything goes well.
Great job. And Caroline Dwyer, Renaissance Planning.
Good morning, Scudder Wag with Jared Walker and Associates, Department Consulting Team.
Okay, and then we have on the line Aaron Kane, DCHC MPO, Brian Litchfield, Chapel Hill Transit.
Can you bring the microphone over?
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Aaron Kane, DCHC MPO, Brian Litchfield, Chapel Hill Transit, Jay Hikus, Jennifer Green and Meg Scully with Go Triangle, Tina Moon with Carborough, and Karsim Anderson with UNC.
Okay, and just so everybody knows, oh,
and Barbara, sorry. And Barbara Fushi, Policy Steering Committee member, Town of Carborough.
Yep, I'm here. Good morning.
Morning, Barbara.
Okay, so, we are attempting to try to do this hybrid in-person and virtual event. So bear with us if technology goes awry, but if you're on the Zoom call, and Barbara, specifically for you, we're going to be monitoring. If you want to raise your hand or chat, I mean, we can hear you, but just we've got Tom over there watching for comments or that sort of thing. And the same for anybody else if you want to type a chat comment. So our agenda today, we're going to try and get out of here by 1 o'clock. We do have coffee and water and snacks, so hopefully we can stay energized. But again, what we really want to do is kind of get from what we are perceiving as kind of a pause moment to say, where have we been with this plan? What do we have already? And how do we start to move it forward? And we've had a lot of good conversations with all of you to better understand kind of maybe some of the concerns with where we've been and where we are. We want to use today to put any of those additional concerns back on the table and talk about, again, how do we get from point A to point B? So our first session is going to be this setting the context session where we'll kind of do a recap of where we've been. We're going to have you all do a couple of interactive exercises. The first one is a discussion of values, because we really feel like right at this moment, this plan has been driven by not only a technical analysis, but there's some community values that really you all as the policy leadership need to think about and make some decisions around. So we want to get a sense of where you stand on some of those items. We're going to talk then about the scenarios as they currently stand and maybe what they are and what they are not, and maybe what they need to be. And then we'll talk about next steps. So with that, just to recap, and I think those of you, so first of all, I've not been involved in this project. It's been led by this wonderful team. And one of the big things coming into this that was clear is that this project was scoped to develop a very, very specific plan, which is what we're calling a revenue constraint plan based on current dollars that are anticipated for the next 20 plus years. So given that there was a fairly tight box of what was explored. And I think that has been, you know, something that we are now hearing from you all, maybe was not the best approach, or you would like to explore or expand upon that. But that's really what drove kind of the development of what we have today. So this is also a requirement to fulfill the Article 43 in terms of these are tax dollars, how do they get distributed? We got to have a plan for it. So we're kind of following the rule book in that sort of way. And then finally, it's got to be a public process. So we do need to go to the public with something, and that's kind of where we are ready to go next. And so we're looking for you all to give us kind of a thumbs up on, now let's go talk to the public with what we've got. So what is also, though, I think of interest, of value, and some of what we've heard from you all in terms of goals is that this plan, as it currently is in development, is just kind of a snapshot of what can be done right now. And what we have heard from you is that there's broader goals that the county has to maybe explore what we might call a vision plan, a more longer range transit plan, those sorts of things. And we want to be able to, and Michael, you put a great email out last night about this. We want to be able to have that conversation, but we have to recognize that we've also got to get kind of this revenue constraint plan done simultaneously. So that's something we want to be able to talk about today, is how do we advance kind of the current plan and kind of what we need to do to meet the requirements of, you know, this Article 43 and what the county's already kind of scoped, but then also maybe how do we start to move towards a planning process that gets you to that bigger, longer term vision. Yes.
So you talked about we've got to get this revenue constraint plan done. So if I look back at 2012 or 2017 plan, right? Both of those plans, you know, involve, among other things, you know, the big elephant in those days, light rail, right? And the assumptions about light rail included, you know, very substantial federal funding. It included, you know, state funding, which not such a good assumption. And it included a significant amount of debt, right? So are you characterizing the 2012 or the 2017 plans as not revenue constrained? Because if those, you know, if those were not revenue constrained, then why do we have to do something different now? And if that was revenue constrained, then why are we thinking about revenue constraints differently now than we did in the past?
Yeah, excellent question.
You want me to answer that?
Okay.
Thank you. So yes, correct. There were different financial assumptions in the 2012 and the 2017 plan. The reasons why we were asked to work within this set of financial constraints was passed to us from Orange County. And I don't know if Craig, you want to speak to why we were asked to produce that particular kind of plan?
Yes. Originally, the 2012 plan had some assumptions of for light rail. It had 50% federal funding, 25% state, 25% local. And there was work done on the LRT at that time, even in 2012, that the 50% was feasible. So there was decisions that were understood by the local governments in Orange County that we could proceed with light rail with the 50% funding, and that 50% funding did not include the heightened debt that was eventually spoke about in 2017. So it proceeded with some assumptions. It proceeded with assumptions of revenue that could be achieved by the transit tax also. 5 years later, the landscape changed for funding. The state was as little as 10%. No, 7.7. Yeah, as high as 10% and less. And that involved the county taking a larger share from 25 to 40 plus, and also a debt service program that extended all the way to 2062. Also, with that extension of our transit plan redo in 2017, it did not involve any more or any additional bus hours. The bus hours that were developed in 2012 were actually only 28,000 new bus hours, which is like 10 bus routes of 2,800 hours a week. You know, that's how you can, so 10 new bus routes would equate to 28,000. 6,000 was the support of some existing services that were going on there, which some of the revenue allowed for provision to support existing service. When we updated in 2017, 2017 to 2062, there was no additional monies for bus service in that whole program, and anything new was wrapped into debt service for what was would be the cost of light rail. So, to answer your question, when we got to this update, the assumptions that the debt service for light rail and the monies that would be received through debt service on how to extend our existing revenues, those are complete unknowns. We cannot guess what we would be investing. It's not likely we would have additional bus service that would use those revenue expansions through debt service. That's doesn't fit the formula for debt service. And what is that possible other capital project that we could assume debt service could support expansion of our base revenue stream? So those are unknowns at this time, and part of this plan will be, do we put money away for a capital project identified, not yet identified, for the future? And do we extend our transit program in that direction, you know, in the future? So what was asked of the consultant is there is X amount of dollars left over from the light rail. What part of that can go to new bus service? And what part of that can go to maybe a future capital project that might involve some other, you know, mass transit component, BRT, commuter rail, and things like that. So the first part of it is staying within for bus service expansions, which is kind of what the focus of this plan is, not the sole focus, but to stay within our annual transit tax revenues that we have, without getting ahead of ourselves for a capital project that might involve debt service financing or some other methods. Travis Mirren, you know, Deputy County Manager, is familiar with the commitments we made in 2017 and how our debt service policy and a relationship with Go Triangle, you know, worked out for us to extend those monies. But hopefully that answers your question. To start, primarily, there's unknowns before you take out large debt service, and those unknowns would be wrapped into a feasible new project that has not yet been explored, either, you know, through an alternatives analysis, you know, small starts, very small starts. I mean, we're not there at that point.
Thank you.
I'd like to push on this discussion a little bit, because I was having the same kind of question that Michael was. And frankly, it took me a little longer than it should have to realize that what we were being asked to do is a very constrained plan. I don't remember this body ever discussing that the scope of the consultant's work. And I don't even think I remember my board discussing the precise scope of the consultant's work. So when you keep noticing, pardon me, but I'm an English major, there's a lot of passive voice being used. The consultants were asked, the plan, what was designed. Who did the asking here?
When we we, meaning Orange County, decided to update the plan, both with Durham County.
Greg, let me just, Orange County is a lot, okay? I'm seriously, did my board specify that it needed to be a fiscally constrained plan, or did it come from your office?
It came from a collection of local governments, staff, local governments within, that was reviewed, the scope of services. Didn't come from Chapel Hill.
So
combined staff from
staff, not elected officials, staff.
That's correct.
It did go in front of the board.
It went in front of my board?
It did in November or December 2019.
Well, the framework
right
for
the scope, yeah.
planning effort was adopted by the board, but the scope consultant was not.
I don't think it was made aware to us that we were going to be doing this hybrid plan, and I frankly think that's how we got hung up for a long time.
Sure,
we didn't realize that. I will point, and I understand the reasons for it. I don't accept that that's where we need to be. I will point out that I have, over the past months, understood that there's a planning process going on right now that Triangle J is involved in regarding the commuter rail from Wake to Durham County. And that planning process certainly anticipates money beyond your level money. So it's not that it's a bad idea. It's not that it can't be done. And realizing that with the 2012-2017 plans, we had, a lot of things that were anticipated. Things anticipated didn't happen, and unanticipated things did happen, and that's always going to be the case. But I'm with Michael here, and probably the rest of us, that we need to put a plan out that recognizes the fiscal limits that we currently have and has a clear vision for where we want to get. Because among other things, how are we going to get the money for the visionary projects if we don't put the visionary projects on the table?
So yeah, but let me, I think we are all in agreement with what you just said. What we probably need to spend some time on today then is to explore what could be in that vision and what couldn't be. So it's clear that yes, there was not buy-in for a revenue constrained approach. We're now where we are. So how do we unconstrain ourselves and say, okay, what is the big picture of what the needs are? How does this plan kind of relate to these other regional initiatives? So I think everybody is in agreement that that may be where we need to go. But before I confirm that, I kind of want to maybe ask the other PSC members for your perspective on this, just to make sure that are we all in agreement that there is a desire to get beyond kind of the current revenue constrained approach? And I'm going to ask, hold on, Michael, let me ask.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay.
I think that we need to look at the long range picture and get the vision on the board before we start talking about how much it's going to cost.
Okay.
Same.
Agreed. Okay. Barbara on the call?
Yes, agreed. Thank you.
Agreed. Okay, so we have consensus from the PSC. So staff, I just think I want to call this as a point of, there's implications to this in terms of scope and budget, all that. We're not going to worry about that. But I guess the point is your policy direction now is that we really do want to explore a unconstrained transit vision.
Words matter.
Sure.
Words also matter. And we keep using this word revenue constrained as if anything else is we're expecting money to fall down from the sky. And it's not that it's revenue constrained, it's tax revenue constrained, right?
Right.
We're not saying that things are just going to happen magically, but we know that there are federal funds that are, Wake County just got $35 million from the federal government to build their ERT. So we know that there are funds out there that can be programmed. Things change, right? We even saw over the last, 2 years, 18 months, sort of projections going up and down about what would happen with the asset sales tax revenues. So none of these things are certain, right? But I think by using the term unconstrained, it makes it also sound undisciplined or unrealistic. And I don't think that that's what we are trying to do here. We are trying to develop a realistic plan that uses a variety of revenue sources for which there may be somewhat different probabilities, but that are still completely realistic and completely achievable.
Good clarification. We'll change our language a little bit because I think that's an important statement, because yes, you're not saying we're going to come up with something that's just high in the sky and doesn't have any sort of rigor to it in terms of what might be plausible or pragmatic approaches to this. I think what we're saying, yeah, it's a very limited, this plan was developed with a very limited revenue stream constraint. And we're going to say, let's not just limit ourselves to that. Let's be broader in what we feasibly can consider in terms of regional, everything you just said. So I think we all agree on that. Well, yeah.
Just so that what we thought would come out of this plan is some ideas for that aspirational direction. Are there monies in this transit tax supported program that would mature in some manner to the future of transit in Orange County? And those ideas would have to be examined before they can be put into a plan with some sort of alternatives analysis, some sort of scope of a project. If we come up with an idea that says BRT in a certain corridor, there is a relatively extensive process to make sure that the cost of that relatively unfunded project, but there are some monies out there, before we could plug it into a financial model, which is part of our plan. When in 2012 the BRT for Chapel Hill was not completely cooked, and it was a $24 million program at that time, and Orange County, as part of the financial model, offered $6 million or 25% of that, and thinking there was those other sources. 5+ years later, after a more elaborate alternatives analysis was done, it's $140 million, somewhere in that range now. And Orange County did support additional monies, 20-25% of that new number. That had a large impact on our financial model. So
actually, 10%.
Well,
6 + 8.
Yeah. So as we move forward with this plan, there will likely be some offshoots of further investigation for how do we expand, towards that future. That we need to understand that at this time we're looking for an update to the plan, and this type of project can be done every few years, but it may say, let's fund an investigation for X capital project in the coming years, and we can use money from the transit tax to be more specific about another capital plan that would involve some sort of BRT, similar to what Wake County did to help move that BRT project along, in their area. And it took about 2 or 3 years, for them to move that along.
So to kind of clarify then, one of the desired outcomes of this plan is to, at a minimum, identify the additional planning that's going to be needed maybe for some of the corridors that we don't know the funding stream, but we know that they need to be on the map, and we need to look at them so that you can start to get a better sense of project cost and then run the financials, right? Am I capturing that correctly? That is a desire that you all have to make sure that this plan identifies those needs as well.
That's correct. And it would not be just existing transit tax monies. Right. If there is an interest to leverage it with debt service similar to what we had with light rail, that will be conscious decisions by the policymakers.
Okay. All right. Well, I want us to keep moving forward.
That's not unexpected. That's kind of how I assumed it would work. We had to do some kind of feasibility analysis before we jump on to the next project. So yeah, I appreciate that being spelled out. So we'll take money and time to do that.
Right. Okay. I want to keep us moving along because I do think there's some content that might be helpful. And I just want to, I think based on what everybody's saying, and Michael, your email kind of suggested this last night, we need to get to some of the ideas that maybe are already percolating in terms of both projects and opportunity corridors, however we want to define it, of what you all would start to think about in terms of a broader, longer term vision plan. So I think it would be helpful. We've got content in here to kind of just remind everybody of, we're calling it Transit 101, but I guess before we even get to that, what we know, and Scudder in particular has done a lot of facilitating around, is that at the end of the day, there will be some sort of revenue constraint, whatever that is. And how you spend your transit money is going to be driven by the values that you kind of have about who are we serving and why, how does it support economic development or jobs or all of those sorts of things. And those values and how we prioritize those values really will influence then the system you develop. And so what was presented to you all in terms of the two bookends of scenarios kind of explored different value sets. So I do think it would be helpful if we talked about that as a policy board, because that's going to influence everything, the long term, the short term. And I think we would love to hear a little bit more from you all on the value side of things. So if we could maybe jump into that discussion next, and then we'll kind of work into then talking more specifically about the scenarios we have, and then what's beyond the scenarios that you all want to maybe start to explore for the plan. Does that seem reasonable? Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to Scudder.
Thanks, Kate. Good morning again, everyone. And so I'm going to present a little bit about the community values questions and how that relates to thinking about how you invest in transit. And then we'll have Caroline talk a little more about the financial picture. Some of this may be a review of some of the things we talked about before, but we want to make sure everyone is on the same grounding as we come into this process. So thinking about how different community values relate to transit. If we look at the range of things that people ask transit to do, or that you may hear from your constituents, things like transit should help people get to jobs. Transit should be spreading service all around the county. Transit should be trying to reduce congestion. Transit should be trying to do these things. These are, a wide range of needs and values and demands that people are asking of you and transit providers to meet. The challenge, of course, we face is that ultimately many of these demands, many of these values are in conflict in where they lead us and what we might invest in for transit. So if we were to start from, say, this subset of goals, getting a lot of ridership, getting many people to jobs, reducing congestion, getting people out of cars, this subset of goals, which may not be everything you hear, but this subset of goals are things that might lead us in a particular direction, particularly a direction that is trying to get a lot of people riding transit. So maximizing ridership relative to cost. If we want to do that, if those were the highest priorities you had overall, we know very clearly how to do that. That is providing useful service that's very liberating for a lot of people so that they can get to places in a reasonable amount of time. And we know very clearly how to do that in terms of designing transit networks and designing transit systems. And the key to that is high frequency service, forming a connected network, reasonably fast and reliable, and focused on transit-friendly places. In particular, because we're investing so much in frequency here, we want to focus that where there's the most people and most activity, because that will get you the most people served, most people riding relative to cost. And we can kind of visualize what does it mean to maximize freedom with this map on the right here. This map on the right here is showing you from the area right off of 15501, where can you get in 15, 30, 45, or 60 minutes? And that isochrone, that blob, is basically a wall around someone's life. If they rely on transit, this is what they can get to. This is what they can reach. This is their maximum opportunity. And if we make those blobs bigger for a lot of people, we're doing something that will get a lot of people riding transit. Frequency is fundamental and comes first when we're thinking about this, because while speed and reliability do matter, frequency is often the most neglected element, and it is neglected because oftentimes we're thinking about things from we want to get there faster, not we want to get you there in a shorter amount of time, because your time on the vehicle is often less than your waiting time on average. Frequency also is critical because it provides 3 independent useful things, which together effectively create a cube value for more frequent service. You go when you want to, you make connections between routes more easily, and you have automatically have better reliability. A more frequent service every 15 minutes or every 10 minutes means if a bus happens to break down, the next one's coming soon, you're going to get there. So, and particularly for shorter trips, frequency can often be the largest, or the waiting time can be the largest part of your travel time. So frequency is critical, and you can think about if there's a gate at the end of your driveway. If that gate only opens once an hour, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., 8 a.m., if you've got to be at work at 7 a.m., you best be in your car with your coffee ready to go at 6 a.m. and hope that gate opens on time. Otherwise, you're going to be late for work, and that happens a couple of times. Obviously, you may lose your job. That's the experience of living on an hourly route, and you rely on that route to get where you're going. The frequency is really, really critical. So, sorry, didn't need to put that in there. So, high ridership, is that really what you want ultimately? Because I've been talking about if you want to get a lot of people riding transit relative to cost, this is what you would do. Because different values require different service. In this fictional example here, there's town on the right, these dots and are people and jobs. You have 18 buses in this fiscally constrained environment. How do you put service down? If we're trying to get as many people riding as possible, we're putting high frequency service where there are lots of people, then we're going to design a system that looks like this. 2 routes, buses coming every 10 minutes because we put 9 buses on each route. That's going to get a lot of people riding because it's very frequent, easy connections, and that's going to do the most to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to get all the green benefits of transit, and also the most to maximize job access for most people, because it's a really short trip time for most people to get to whatever job they're trying to reach. But we've only served about 70% of the population here. Mrs. Smith, Mr. Jones, in the southeast corner of this town really doesn't have service. But this is the thing that would maximize the usefulness of service and get a lot of people using service. And if they came to complain, part of the thing you would have to say to them is, we have set a policy that we're trying to maximize ridership, and therefore we're not serving everyone. And we're going to measure your success on productivity. You're going to measure your success on ridership. Alternatively, if you prefer to make sure everyone has that lifeline of service, that everyone has something that they can rely on no matter where they live, no matter how much it costs to serve them, even if it costs a lot per trip to serve them, then we're going to spread service around. And we'll have 10 routes with only 1 or 2 buses on each route. And that means now waits are long because each route is maybe only running once an hour. And it's harder to connect between routes because you have long waits when transferring. But now everyone has something. 100% of people in this town have some kind of service, even if it's a long wait. You've provided that lifeline. You've provided service to every district, every electoral district, every neighborhood, and so on. And we have, really fit that value of making sure we're not leaving them behind and covering everyone. And that would be then measuring your success on coverage, not on ridership, not on productivity, within that budget of services. So ultimately, we know that almost everyone really wants us to do both of these things. And oftentimes at the same time, the challenge we face, of course, is within a constrained budget. And even in a visionary plan, when you have some sort of constraint, you can only do so much. And the more we're doing of coverage things, that's $1 or a bus we're spending, not doing frequency and ridership oriented things. So when we're being asked potentially to do both things at the same time with the same dollar, it's like sitting in the back of the taxi and telling your driver to go right and left at the same time. It's physically impossible. So it's helpful to think about how you balance these goals, how much you want to prioritize one set of goals over another as we think about how to balance your investments in transit. So with that,
before we,
Right. Reminder, we all want to try to speak into the mic so that everyone can hear us, particularly.
so you stay there, Scott.
I'm going to stay here.
Before we move on, this is kind of a really big, I guess, part of the concept of the scenarios that were developed and just generally transit planning. These are the things we're always weighing. So before we get off of this, I just want to see, does anybody have questions or commentary on what was just described by Scott? Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I think the way you're describing are really second order goals, and we need to have a conversation about first order goals first. Because ridership versus coverage or frequency versus coverage, you need a context in which to make that. So if your first order goal is doing something about climate change, or making sure people get to jobs, or making sure that we reduce BMPs, it's only after you've established what those goals are, and then really meaningfully, or racial equity or economic equity, it's only after you establish those first order goals can then you meaningfully have a conversation about coverage versus frequency, because now you've established the framework within which you're going to evaluate those choices. And so just to say, do I like, I live in downtown Chapel Hill, so I love, coverage isn't an issue for me, right? But it seems to me, you have to really be thinking, why do we invest in transit in the first place? We tend to assume transit is an understood good, and therefore we can have these conversations about frequency versus coverage. But if your goal is to, like I say, just to pick an extreme example, but which was, for example, the genesis of the New York City subway system, the goal was we've got to get people jobs, right? And that's why the New York City subway system started, because Manhattan was, people don't realize this, at the turn of the last century, New York City was the largest manufacturing center in the country. And there weren't enough people living in Manhattan to serve those jobs. So they created a rapid transit system to get people to jobs, and then did what you did. And so I think until we think about why we want transit, what goals does transit have to meet for us as a community, then we can have a discussion about frequency versus coverage.
So I think one of the key things I want to try to make sure we understand is that I absolutely want to relate those first order goals to this geometric question. And so that's what I want to help everyone understand, because when you say get people to jobs, let's make sure be as clear as we can for the English majors, for all of us, which is, what do we mean by get people to jobs? Because if we mean get as many people to as many jobs as reasonably fast in a competitive way as possible, then that's something that would lead you in the direction of a frequent service focused on relatively dense places, because that's going to maximize most people's access to a lot of jobs. If, however, you mean we want to make sure everyone has at least some transit access that they can use to get to a job, no matter how long it takes them, even if it takes 2 hours, because of how low the frequency is and how hard the connections are, that's really leading you in a coverage direction. So absolutely, I think this whole exercise that Kate wants to go through here is, let's talk about those first order goals and help everyone make sure they understand which direction those goals might take you in as you're thinking about this.
I just want to say, I think that's exactly right. What you guys said. We've been presented these two extremes. From the that's one thing that has been clear to us from the beginning. So I think we do need to back up and implement our first order values. I think we need to sort of cut and chase.
All right.
Okay.
So let's jump to it. Okay. Mic thing. So I can read it. So we've got kind of a list of 12 right now, and these are some of the. Okay. Sure. Except then they can't see it.
Well, perhaps what we can do is actually put the slideshow on the list of goals, and then people on Zoom can see all the goals that are on that slide.
Very good call. Thank you.
Presented on the
there we go. Perfect. Okay. So we have taken a crack at 12 first order goals. However, I don't know that these reflect everything that you all care about. So what I'd like to have you do, I'm going to read through them, and then you all actually have little sticky dots. And you only get to use 3. And the reason I'm going to ask you to do that is I want your top 3 goals from this list. If there is a goal that you are not seeing on this list, you've also got sticky notes sitting in front of you, and I would like for you to write that goal down and come up here and post it up here. But let me just kind of read through these. First order goal, we want to get people out of their cars. And maybe that's related to the greenhouse gas emission issue. Maybe it's related to other environmental concerns, or maybe it's related to congestion, but it's kind of getting more people in the region out of cars and on transit. Getting people to jobs is number 2. Equally serving, let's say, all parts of the county or all people. Goal number 3 is reducing congestion. Goal number 5 is making sure everyone actually is near a bus, meaning, you know, the bus goes close to where people live. Number 6 is ridership, getting as many people on buses as possible. Number 7 is running the system like a business, and this gets to kind of a financial consideration of the transit system. Making transit convenient and easy to use, serving the elderly or disabled, not costing too much, supporting kind of walkable development patterns, and making some of the new development that's happening in the region more accessible by serving it with transit. So these may or may not work for you in terms of first order goals, but what I would ask is maybe take a few minutes, and if there's something that is in the back of your mind that's not on this list that you would put up, and maybe it's just the broad environmental sustainability or whatever that is, or we need to serve the most disadvantaged in our community, whatever those additional goals might be, please write some of those down and then bring them up to the flip chart as well as your 3 dots. And you can put your if you give me the notes, we'll kind of add to this list, and then you guys can put the dots up. That seem reasonable? Yes.
So I don't want to get us bogged down in what I'm about to say, because I know we need to keep moving.
Sure.
But are you using the words values and goals synonymously in this exercise? So it would just, if the answer is yes, then I can make do with that and just move forward. But I just kind of see, I use those words very differently.
Yes, these are goals, and you're right. These are not value statements.
Cool. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing over here. Thank you, Mary Jan. I think that was Jan Weaver.
Yeah. So let's do that.
Barbara, you can put yours in the chat too.
Just a moment. I want you all to write down on the sticky notes the values that you all care most about. General community
Did we say
values.
the top 3? Top 3?
Yeah, give me your top 3 values as you're setting the context for your policymakers thinking about transit, and kind of what are the top values that are going to drive your thinking behind that in terms of community benefit and community values. And let's start with that, and we'll put those sticky notes up on the board.
Jan, or you give me examples of what you would describe as value as opposed to goal?
Equity, like
equity.
Racial equity is value.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Barbara, I'll write yours down for you if you want to drop them in the chat.
Do you want one value per sticky note?
Yes, please. Okay. One value per sticky note. When we type it inside.
Yeah.
As a housekeeping note for those of you who brought reusable bottles, the water filler bottle filler out there does actually work, even though the water fountain looks like it's closed. So we can track.
I'm having trouble reading the screen. Is that slide presentation available to us as well?
I can send it.
Yeah, we can send it.
We also have a little more slack.
Okay, I'm gonna do a little bit of recap because I think the good news is there's a lot of consistency and a lot of folks are saying very similar things as it relates to values. So we have 5 sticky notes that are around the topic of environmental sustainability. So that means just about everybody here kind of says that's a first order value that we see the transit system plan needing to kind of support or reinforcing. The second one with an equal number is the notion of equity and inclusivity. I didn't say that right. Anyway, kind of equitable, racial and economic equity, and basically that the transit system should be serving this community at large in terms of improving kind of equitable outcomes for folks. Those are the 2 that kind of bubble to the top as first order values. You know, that's the language we're using. Okay, there's some additional ones, and I just wanted to clarify affordability. Is this affordability, housing, life, all the above? Just what is that?
Well, I started to write that down as economic opportunity.
Okay.
So it's in that family of like, if you have access to affordable transit, then maybe that makes your housing more affordable. If you're in affordable housing, then maybe you can spend more money on transit. Sort of just like, how does it contribute to that, to an affordable?
Okay. Affordable quality of life, maybe.
Yeah, but maybe I'm not too hung up on that.
Okay.
That's a good one. You know, goes to the H+T analysis, how they're most affordability.
Yep. Okay. So I would take that a step further and say that the system that you're designing ought to be looked at through that lens. How is the transit that's being provided actually making the household expenditures for people living in the area? Like you can balance some of that, right? Like if I can live without a car, maybe I can afford a little bit more household. Likewise, if you know my house is expensive and you know, yes, I think we're on to that one. Creation of a vibrant community, I'm presuming that that is related to transit serving kind of a slightly more dense, compact, walkable place. Does anyone want to expand on that as a value? Okay.
It's that it's allowing people to access all kinds of cultural and other opportunities. And it also, for me at least, also means, promoting, job growth and economic development. It's a place where people want to live. It's a place where people want to be, a place where people want to come.
Okay, so it really is in the broadest term kind of a, and again, if I'm thinking with a little bit of a transit hat on, it's creating places where there's multiple destinations that people can connect to, from cultural to jobs to social, all of that. And
supporting job growth in an intelligent way.
Okay.
So that.
All right, and then we've got a couple here. One is connectivity and access for all. And I'm presuming that is related to just everybody in the county having maybe some transportation options or transportation choices. Am I saying that right?
I think that's right. And since I'm from Mebane, I'm the one who's from the West Dense area.
Sure.
Where we're experiencing tremendous population growth and job growth. So my concern is connecting residents now and getting the systems into place for the future as we continue to grow as a destination. So right now, the population is not there. We have the most expensive route to the network for Rider, but it's providing a very essential service for many people.
Right. Okay. And then we've got geographic and service equity. And I think, Barbara, that was one of your comments. And supporting families, again, kind of helping people to get access to jobs and services.
So that was mine. I think it's closer to, I would put mine and Jen's and Michael's at least as concentric at minimum. They all reinforce each other, talking about. Well, I guess by supporting families, I do think affordability. I mean, the ability for an average family to have the workers get to work affordably and will get during that what happens. But I think all of us are talking about a dense network where a lot of interactions can happen and you might not have that car or not have two cars.
I still think we've got 5 values, but let's come to consensus on this. So again, value number 1 is kind of an equity goal, and specific to equity here, it is about improving as much as possible the lives of those that are disadvantaged or otherwise need a lift up, and therefore the system needs to be really intentional about that. Is that a kind of broad way to talk about equity? Okay. The second value then is really around environmental sustainability. The third one is, I'm going to call kind of, we're talking about the family household, and ultimately, how do we make the quality of life as it relates to my ability to afford to live in the area, have a good job, feed my family, like all of the things that make it such that I can financially feel secure. And providing transportation options, it can be part of that mix, right? So this is kind of a financial, a safety and security goal for families in our community as it relates to affordability of our community. This goal then around kind of creating a vibrant community is kind of saying that we want to create places in Orange County where you've got strong economic activity, cultural centers, and kind of social areas. But bottom line is, if you look at kind of the way communities grow and develop, the more access you provide in terms of the more, whether that's access by transit, whether you are co-locating a lot of things together and creating a lot of walkable areas, the more access you provide, the stronger the economic impact. And so creating these nodes of vibrancy is something that that's a value. You want to kind of create these centers of vibrancy. I'm not sure that's the right language, but let's call it. Michael, this is kind of yours. In a value statement, we're saying we want to create centers of economic prosperity.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, I think it's supporting the creation of cultural and economic and social. It means, you know, nexus is loci for the community, right?
So they are hubs. So we are talking about kind of a.
Not necessarily that they're hubs, but that the activity exists wherever it exists, however it exists. You know, I mean, clearly Chapel Hill and most other, you know, Carrboro, Hillsborough, we have downtowns, we have, you know, and so I think implicitly many of us, at least when we think about some of this stuff, at least, you know, when I try to peel away my own thinking, well, you know, we're kind of thinking about what do we do about downtown or other places, but it doesn't have to be. The other thing I want to actually ask my colleagues sort of as a question, because, you know, again, Orange County, although we tend not to think about it as such, is a major job center, right? And so, with, you know, a lot of the way the language we've been using has been sort of talking about Orange County residents, right? But we have, in the case of, you know, UNC Healthcare and some others, major job centers, and most of the people who work in those places don't live in Orange County, right? But they work there, and we need those places. We need UNC to be successful. We need UNC Healthcare to be successful. And so if we only think about, when we think about getting people to job, if the only people we're thinking about, for example, or, you know, if the only people we're thinking about are people who live either in Chapel Hill or Orange County, we're missing an awful lot of folks who work at those places, right? The majority of the people who work at UNC and UNC Healthcare live in Orange County. And so I think I would ask my colleagues, are we, when we think about equity, when we think about our just efforts to plan for Orange County transit, is our sole focus on residents, or are we also trying to make sure that we have vibrant, vital employers who may be drawing from elsewhere?
Yeah.
We have a tremendous number of UNC employees in that in Alamance County, as well as in Orange County. And our routes are very crowded. Pre-pandemic, those buses were full on a very regular basis. So this goes to the density of where residents live as well as where the work centers are. But if you only have your bus route running up and down 15501, you're not serving a lot of employees that are coming into Chapel Hill for work on a daily basis. So then we get into frequency of that service, and it would be better serve those folks, those employees, if we had more frequent service on those lines, even though they're more expensive per rider.
Okay.
That is growing a lot, because it's an affordable place to live. So that's a quality of life issue. And it goes into the mix of the sustainability for all of these other folks and the family security for these folks. If they can have public transit as well as affordable housing and a good job at Carolina, these are all very good things that elevate everybody in the county and the surrounding area. So I think all of these goals or values are interrelated.
Oh, for sure.
And it's all about how do we balance the service so it serves all of them. Yeah. I think that we all are on the same page about sustainability and environmental soundness. Personally, if everybody was genetic or genetic and walk there, that would be the ideal world. But that's not the way our world works. So what we have to do is deal with the situation as it is and come up with the best solutions we can.
Well, and Teddy, I would also add that it's growing employment side, right? Yes, we do. Deadline expanding, we've got the ADB, exactly. Yes. So we need to think about those two as well. Yes, we do.
So maybe, Michael, I'm sorry, did you want to add or answer Michael's question or add to it?
No, I mean, I think it's an important point to make that I think about in my head. But it's good to remember that we're thinking about both of those things at the same time. I mean, I can't imagine not connecting those job centers to the people who work there. And you know, we do have a responsibility to our residents as well to give them opportunities, I think, to get where they need to go.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though, as you do put on the hat of really valuing the job growth in the county means thinking about service outside your borders. You know, it just does. And so that becomes part of a strategy. You know, it's like, okay, we can't just serve our residents. In order for our county to be prosperous, we've got to get residents from outside of our county into some of these centers and promote the growth of other centers. So I think that is a value I'd like to kind of keep on its own, which is kind of this job growth, economic prosperity that's a value. Okay, the last one, now I'm kind of wondering if this is really its own standalone value or if we only have the 4, but this one talks about geographic and service equity and connectivity and access for all, which I then wrote kind of transportation choice. I feel like maybe those kind of get split into the equity and the quality of life affordability. What do you guys think? Or is that a standalone value to you all in terms of just the way it's written? And Barbara, I may pick on you for that one because it is about geographic and service equity, which I think is different than equity. So I guess my question is, I'm reading this and saying there's this larger set of values around the quality of life for all residents in the county. And that means having transportation choices and affordable kind of housing options, and that can be facilitated with transit investment.
So Barbara Fushi, Carborough. So when I said I put together the geographic and the service equity, I am an advocate for coverage out in the county as much as possible, as well as the elderly and the disabled. I just think we can't afford to leave, you know, those folks out of the equation. Certainly the ridership piece continues to be important, especially, you know, in our denser and more walkable parts of our municipalities. But I just think about expanding, you know, geographically and as much as possible, because just realizing that the farther we go out into the county, it's like the longer the wait times are going to be. And that's just the setup of that. But also realizing that access is a big piece to me, you know, folks having access to those services and them just, you know, realizing how those services will ultimately have to be set up with the longer wait times and things of that nature. And the service equity piece, I put geographic and service together. Okay, when I get to the service part of it, it's kind of like the same concept, you know, with the levels of service that we are providing in different areas of the county, and just trying to make it as equitable as possible. And I'm still on the access thing, you know, of everybody, you know, having some type of access and increased access where possible to our transit options. So I think I put that with something else, didn't I? I said geographic and service equity. Oh, and the equal amount of transit in all parts of the county. And I say where possible, because I know, you know, it gets difficult, you know, as we start to, you know, think about trying to get it all over the county, because certainly it's not going to be the same. The ridership won't be the same. And certainly the frequency won't be the same. So that frequency piece, of course, is key, as we talked about earlier. So that's my 2 cents. I think I would want what did you say you wanted to pair it with? Was that Caroline talking, or?
It was me. This is Kate. I would like to, pair it with the quality of life, because I think there's a quality of life, affordability and transportation choice for all dynamic that I'm hearing. And that's what I was thinking, Barbara, we could put your sticky note up with that bucket of values.
I mean, I'm not against that.
Okay.
I mean, it does add to the, to the quality of life. I'm not against it unless somebody else, maybe Sally, Michael, or Jen have something else to add. Thank you.
I'm the blue ones there. And when I was talking about piggybacking on Jen's idea, when I was looking for my concept of it, what I'm thinking of it is that one really can't apply to somebody who lives in northwestern Orange County. Because, I mean, unless we did have like unlimited money, we could run 15-minute buses out there. Because what I was thinking about, that value is the ability of a family to live so close to the bus stop that they don't have to have a car to get to work. And I think that's a little different. I think that is different than what Barbara's talking about. Barbara's acknowledging that in sparsely populated parts of the county, there's not going to be that frequency, but it is a value to serve those people as well. Is that right, Barbara?
Yes, you are correct. Yes.
Okay, so we do have a distinction here where we are saying there's still a value to serve all.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes.
Maybe we discussed it later, but sort of, I think, without necessarily needing to, we sort of slipped into this as a discussion about buses, and we need to pull it back to a discussion around transportation. Because either today or in the future, there are going to be lots of other ways to support people's mobility needs. And so if we think about this, gee, do we want to send the bus to rural Orange County? Yeah, probably not. But, as we think about, electric or autonomous vehicles and all sorts of things, meeting these needs in quite different ways becomes more and more possible. And so we're not, I'm not saying we make choices today about mode share, but I think, this conversation has been kind of framed as a discussion about buses. And I think, we'll just be better if we can think about our goals first in terms of how do we want to serve people's mobility and transit needs. And then, buses work great in Chapel Hill, not so much in rural Orange County, right? And so let's, and Orange, to its credit, so it started that kind of an experiment with on-demand services, to meet those mobility needs.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good distinction. I would argue that I think we can agree that if the environmental goal or environmental value is important, implicit in that is that everybody driving a car by themselves for every trip in our county is not a good thing. And therefore, what we're trying to solve for is a little bit of that, right?
Yeah.
And what the solution is to that isn't always a bus, but it's something outside of that single occupancy vehicle, a slightly inefficient trip, also a costly trip for some in terms of the ability to afford that car. And that is something that the transit plan kind of covers. But we're not funneling down to every challenge. The answer is a bus. I agree with that. Right. Okay. All right.
And
well,
can I just step in real quick on following what Michael said? So, right, he is correct, and I agree with what he said. And just remembering, pre-COVID, about the van pools and the car pools and the those different options that were available at work. I know. They were at my job. I work in Research Triangle Park. I work for LabCorp. And so, in the age of COVID, I was just thinking to myself, how good of an option that is even now, as far as being, enclosed with potentially folks you don't know, in a carpool, you know, or a van pool. That was just a thought I had. And like, are those still, would they still be viable options? Maybe, you know, maybe not. It was just something that kind of, I was thinking about, you know, as Michael talked about other options, and he may not even be talking about the carpool or the van pool, but that was just something that I thought about there, especially, you know, in the age of COVID and the Delta variant and all that, and folks just trying to be careful.
All right, good points. Yeah, please, go ahead, Scudder.
Going back to the, I think what Sally and Barbara were talking about in terms of the service and geographic equity versus, I guess, affordability or economic opportunity, and where those might, thinking about where those might lead you and what differences might come from that is, in my mind, as someone who's thinking about what is the service you might design to meet those goals. What I hear when I hear of, you know, affordability for as many people as possible is something that gives a lot of people the option not to have to own a car. And that means frequent useful service for a lot of people versus when you're talking about, you know, providing something for everyone, that certainly is leading more in the coverage-oriented direction, absolutely. And so, yeah, that ultimately needs some thinking carefully about how you balance those because they're leading you in different directions.
All right, I'm going to attempt to summarize again on the screen here. And Barbara, I apologize, we'll get you back on screen. And for those on the screen, we'll get back to you in just a moment here. But again, I'm going to try, and we won't get stuck on words too much, but equity, environmental sustainability, I'm going to call it economic prosperity, because I think this is a kind of a job supporting sort of notion. And then we've got, I'm going to say, an affordable, attainable kind of quality of life. And then I am going to put one out there that is kind of an access for all, you know, that there's a transportation option outside of your car for all, because I do think that's something that we've heard.
And listening to them, I wanted to just dive more into what do people mean when they say equity and inclusivity. Mm-hmm. What would you, how would you measure the equity and inclusivity of a transit system? Vote independent, doesn't matter.
I was sitting here thinking the same thing, and I don't know how to do that because when a lot of people when they think equity, but when they do the sort of the mental math, they default to equality. And they're quite different things. And I know how to measure equality. I don't know how to measure equity.
Right.
Well, I'll take a stab at it because I actually wrote down racial equity and social justice for other disadvantaged folks. And the first thing that I think about with that, and sorry for lessons, but I'm in it, is in Chapel Hill. I hope that we will end up developing a new affordable housing neighborhood on the Green Track. It may not make the most financial sense in the world to serve that neighborhood with 15-minute service. But I would like to see us aim for that, or something close to that, in the interest of racial equity and economic justice for that neighborhood. So that's one example of the way I would be willing to compromise another value in cost to serve and particularly locally underserved neighborhood that needs service.
Yeah, I would add another example just to give the Hillsborough example, which is, you know, because of residential segregation, you know, in Hillsborough, that most, not all, but most of the people who can walk to downtown Hillsborough, walk to a grocery store, you know, that live in a walkable community, most of those people are white people. And there's folks in predominantly neighborhoods of color that do not have a safe way to get to the grocery store, that it's like life or death, you know, to try to walk to a grocery store, and a lot of those people don't have cars. And so kind of thinking about some options for, you know, connecting there, which, you know, also ties, you know, with residential segregation, it ties back in a lot to the H+2 thing again.
So I think we are saying, Sarah, that from a measurement standpoint, or when we say the word equity in this context, we are being very specific about racial equity and social justice, which means you can start to map where those folks are living, what jobs they have access to, and look at your system relative to those outcomes, right? And that's something that we value.
I agree with that. I think we already have a lot of those maps, and we know that those centers have lower car ownership ratios. Some of that, I think, you know, from Method's point of view, we need to invest as a city in a circulator to get people connected to these other services that are provided by other service providers. That's our responsibility as a city. And Hillsborough probably has that service. I'm not sure.
The county does it for us. Yes.
He's got a circulator for us as well. We need to talk more about that. But for me, inclusivity also means regional inclusivity. And we have people who are lower income, who are in the remote areas of the county, who also need to be served.
And I think there needs to be some notion of transit dependency, right? There are folks who have options, and maybe we don't like it from an environmental perspective, but they do have options. They do have a car, they can afford to have a car. And then there are folks who don't have a car, who do, but are spending, you know, using much of their income to operate that car. And so it's really trying to understand, you know, some concept of need and how are you meeting people's needs from, you know, from a transportation perspective.
Absolutely. So Scudder, back to your question, and I think what we're hearing is that this is a pretty important first order value and goal of the system, which is this definition of equity. And it's kind of like, that's got to be hit first, and then we build from there.
So
I'm sorry. Somebody else was talking. I can wait. Was somebody else talking?
No, go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, okay. So in talking, and I appreciate everybody's comments around equity, racial and social justice, and, you know, people who don't have options. I know, you know, across Orange County, as well as in municipalities, you know, there's the GARE, you know, the GARE training and the GARE initiative that's going on. And certainly I would think that you know, transit, you know, could be or would be a part of that conversation as it relates to, you know, policies, practices, procedures. And, you know, that's just what came to my mind when I saw that, you know, is all the work and the training that's going on around GARE, as well as Orange County. You know, it's countywide with this equity collaboration. So and certainly transit, you know, it's one of our top issues, you know, with housing and economic development and all the other stuff, you know, that our local electeds talk about and work on and set policy and vote on policy on. And so, you know, certainly that's a plus, you know, when we're talking about it here, but also just knowing that through the GARE initiative and other racial equity initiatives across the county, that transit would be a part of that discussion as well, is what I would think. You know, I know in Carrboro, you know, we're kind of, you know, sort of, you know, as we do different transit projects, I think there's a staff member on, Tina Moon, you know, certainly we're looking at demographics, you know, and who's going to be served by making this change or with this project, you know. And so I know in my municipality, we're already starting to do that, which I think is a win for everybody. So I just wanted to add that in. Thanks.
So I just want to emphasize that thinking about this, that you could interpret this in two different ways potentially, you know, as a social justice inclusivity that is focused on making sure everyone who's low income has some access to something, no matter where they are in the county, would lead you in a very poverty-oriented direction. A social justice inclusivity sort of priority that is, let's do the most we can to help people not have to buy cars if they're low income, is something that might encourage you to focus either to, you know, frequent service to the places where most people who are impoverished live. So it's important to think carefully about your, weighing the priorities within that value.
Scott, I think that's a great point. Thanks for making that distinction, because I was sitting here thinking like it would be easy for us to kind of just get carried away and be like, oh my God, we've got to like, it just makes it seem overwhelming because of the way inequity is distributed in numerous ways throughout the county. But at the end of the day, it's our job as policymakers to just make some choices, about what, how we can do the best we can with what we have, and we, just have to make choices about that.
And how we start thinking about the ladder, how the Jim was too. Yeah, we're talking about the neighborhoods within or in jurisdiction.
And I think ultimately what we have to, at some point you have to convert these sort of abstract discussions about goals into actual options based on data and cost. And then you actually make real choices. It's very easy to conceptually say we'd like to do this or that. But ultimately you look at the data, you look at the numbers, and then you actually make a choice, based on whatever, calculus each of us chooses to apply to it. But I think the other thing that will be very helpful, so one of the things I think most of us would agree on is that, however we sort of think about things, there isn't enough money for transit. Certainly not. The $8 million in Orange County, that's a small fraction of what we need to meet the transit in Orange County. All the half-cent sales taxes in the triangle is still a small fraction of what's needed to meet the transit needs. So I think it's also important as we move through the planning process to be documented, unfunded needs, because there are efforts currently underway. There will be more to think about how can we expand funding, in a variety of ways, right? And so the more we can make the case for how that funding is are, the higher the probability that we get more money from any one of a number of sources.
So I think that's a really good maybe segue to taking a break because it's 10:30 and we promised a few breaks here. But I think what you're raising, and I think it's been really helpful for us to kind of boil this down to these 5 buckets of values, because at the end of the day, I think some of the tension around where the plan currently sits is that we haven't had this discussion as a collective, where everybody had a chance to really kind of weigh in. The scenarios as they've been developed so far, I think, can now be evaluated against this. If we were just to stop and do that, we could do that. But I think moving forward, what you're suggesting, which I think is the desired outcome generally, is that we need a values-driven plan that fully identifies the needs. And then we back into, okay, how do we start to afford some of those given what money we have? And then what are those other priorities that really, really matter to us given our value set that we need to find funding for? I mean, that's what we want to get to, right? Okay. All right, on that note, let's take 15, what are we doing, Caroline, 15 minutes? All right, we're gonna take a break from now until 10:45. There are snacks. Those of you on the virtual, we may mute for a few minutes here and then come back to you. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you all. We had some technology challenges. Caroline, are you ready now? Okay.
Okay. So now that we've had the values discussion, we're going to go back to the 2 scenarios that were developed and see if we can link those up with the values and the scenario. So we had some questions from the steering committee about the assumptions underlying the scenarios, how those were developed, the steps that went into developing those. So we'll walk through a couple of those. You've seen the scenarios, so we'll just do a high-level overview of some of their key elements, and then we'll go back to those values and see what we can connect to the scenarios and what's still missing and what we might need to enhance those. Yes.
Just to add to that context, I think we all agree we're not sticking with these as the only thing forward. But nonetheless, we think that a lot of what's in these is likely what you all want to see in the plan. So we want to start with this as kind of the baseline, if you will, and then we build on this or build on these scenarios. Does that make sense? Okay.
Right. So I think the first point is that the scenarios were developed sort of working within this set of assumptions that were bounded by the dedicated transit funding streams. So, you know, we say constrained by the tax revenue available for transit, not just the house and sales tax, but the other few taxes that are collected through different programs for Orange County. This is a shorter term investment strategy. So as we discussed, there's sort of, we're not really hitting on that longer term vision for transit. The idea behind the conceptual scenarios is to illustrate ways that service can be provided by showing two extremes of a spectrum of service. So Scudder talked a little bit about this, right? You know, we're thinking about coverage over here and ridership over here, and you know, here's what some investment potentials could look like if you're sort of operating within those extremes. However, recognizing that the final option, once we've gotten feedback from you all, from the public, from the transit service providers, that ultimate transit plan will probably fall somewhere in the middle, or you know, maybe slightly to one side or slightly to the other side, but probably won't represent one of those extremes. And then just based on, we kind of skipped over some financial stuff, but we're going to go back to that. I know there was a question about the operating versus the capital expenses. But one thing, and Scudder, I don't know if you want to speak to this quickly. There was a little bit of an imbalance in that existing distribution for Orange County between the operating and capital expenses. Just given the size of the agency and service. So.
Okay, sorry, I'm sorting now. I think so we started in these scenarios with the primary focus being on what additional service might you operate. Building on the framework idea being that the service is the thing that delivers people, it moves people, it is the mobility. And so it's the operating fund that delivers that, and operating funds are extremely limited in their things you can't get in really many other places. You know, federal dollars for operating are very limited. So the focus was on the service operation, and the capital element is kind of secondary, primary in the thinking of these scenarios, and was therefore something we were going to dive into in more detail in the draft recommendations. I think just generally, we at JWA tend to take a focus of let's define the service and the network you want to try to achieve, and then sort out what is it you need to do, both operating capital-wise, to do that. And so that's why we were focused on the operating portion. The other fundamental thing to point out is just at the most, you're looking at the available funding in the future being approximately $8 million a year. In out years, and that if you used all of that, that could be leveraged for significant capital investment. But the things that have been identified in the short-range transit plans of all of the providers are primarily operating expansions and improvements or frequency improvements, and so we work from those as the primary things to focus on. Does that help your context?
Just again, just for clarity, you know. You say short term, is that what's your sense? What's your definition of short term versus longer term? You think we should be thinking?
I think that varies based on context. However, for this particular plan, you know, given the availability of funding currently and in like the next 5 years is pretty low. You know, I think that the scope of work said 2030. I think we went out a little further to 2040 and started to, you know, because you don't really start to accumulate
useful amounts of revenue until, I don't know, 25-ish.
So just put a little more context on that, the forecast from Go Triangle staff on the financial side shows that over the next 5 years, you have on average about $300,000 to $400,000 a year remaining to spend, which is not a lot. In beginning in 2025, you've got about $4 to $5 million per year on average. When you get to 2035 to 2040, you are looking more at like $8 to $8.5 million per year in the dollars that you can spend. And so constructing the scenarios, we built off of what was the most you could spend in that farthest out year to say this is what the dollars could buy you at the most you could buy, the furthest out in that forecast. And obviously those things, if you eventually decide you do want to fund, would be implemented over time. Most of them probably starting in 2025 to 2030, and then probably about half of them, financially speaking, half the dollars, and then the remainder further out.
But again, getting back to our earlier conversation, certainly once you get, let's say, arbitrarily the decade of the 2030s, if you make some modest assumptions about the availability of federal, clearly, if we finally get the North-South PRT built, no guarantees about that, but there we're looking at roughly 80% federal funding. So if you think about $8 million, let's say a year, and not all of that, but let's say great silly numbers, right? So let's say you say $4 million might be available for some new kinds of investments, and you leverage that, let's say with some federal funding, that can be $30 or $40 million that you now can spend on doing things. And typically capital will go through, right? Unless something changes markedly, federal funding for operations is limited on a good day. So I think we need to sort of build that kind of thinking. Clearly, we've got this roadmap, for the next 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is. And our wiggle room there is pretty limited. But I sort of view it as a sort of cone that opens up, and as we move out into the future, we have a lot more options that we can explore. And even if, to Craig's point, is entirely correct, we don't have details on what, some super connection from Durham to Orange or someplace else would look like. But, back at the envelope, we can start scoping things out, right? And, as we start thinking about it, there's a sort of a third category, right? There's sort of operations, there's capital, but then there's planning. And so I think we need to really start incorporating that kind of thinking as we move into the out years.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's what, I think it'd be helpful for us to go ahead, knowing that that's where we're going to get to, which is that we're going to open up this conversation about the funding assumptions, right? I mean, that's what we're all kind of agreeing. We're going to look beyond what this very limited funding source is in order to come up with a more expansive plan in terms of understanding needs and potential funding scenarios. What I think will be helpful is let's go through the scenarios as they currently stand and talk about them a little bit in the context of these values. And then for you all to react more broadly to, given what is kind of reflected in these scenarios, are there specific corridors, geographies, service characteristics? What are some of those needs that you all aren't seeing in what we've already got in terms of what's on the table? And I think that will help us then begin to move into that broader unfunded needs conversation about transit. Does that sound okay? Okay, so Carolyn, let's jump into this.
Okay. So quickly, just before we do that, a little bit of background on sort of the groundwork we did prior to developing those scenarios. We reviewed the short range transit plans from each of the transit service providers, which identifies their unfunded priorities. We had some preliminary discussions, both with all of you and the transit service providers through conversations and meetings and listen to what priorities sort of emerged out of those conversations. We developed the Regional Connections Opportunities Report, which identified transit markets, transit need, different places where there might be opportunities to enhance service connections that don't currently exist based on commuter flow models and things like that. As Scudder mentioned, we worked with the folks over at Go Triangle using their financial model to help us understand what would be available to spend in the future and what was already accounted for through existing service and programs. And then we've been working with the folks over at Durham and their contracting team to make sure that things that we are proposing ultimately will align with recommendations that they will have in their updated transit plan, which is still an ongoing process. So you've seen these before. We have two scenarios, conceptual illustrations of ways that transit could potentially be invested. As we've mentioned, these kind of represent, you know, two more extreme ways of investing money in the transit system. Will probably ultimately fall somewhere in the middle of these two concepts. But really these are helpful for helping people understand, you know, where investments can be made, like the scale of investments that we're talking about. You know, we're not talking about 25 new bus routes, we're talking about enhancing some service and, you know, changing some things, providing some mobility on demand, things like that. But it, you know, it's a way to sort of see graphically the two types of, or two values that might be incorporated into a transit plan. So the ridership with scenario A, and then scenario B being more of that access for all type of scenario. So just some of the specifics in these scenarios. I think they have about 6 projects each that we've included. 3 of those projects cross over both of the scenarios. So there's improvements to the 400 and 405 Go Triangle routes and the Chapel Hill Transit D route, which serve parts of 15501 and then some local service. One bit of feedback we have gotten from the transit service providers is that those particular improvements will be most useful if they're considered as sort of a package of improvements. The D and the 400/405, you know, support each other in a way that makes them most useful if they're together. So those are across in both of the scenarios. And then scenario A, which is more of your ridership focused scenario, there's expanded service on the 800 route Go Triangle, which runs along 54, NC 54, connects to the regional transit center. And then Chapel Hill Transit expanded service, increased headways, so less time between buses on the NS route. And then extended service hours, so longer, you know, during the day and more days per week on the CW and CL routes as well. Scenario B is your coverage scenario. So that one features some enhancements to specific high ridership routes, which is the 400, the 405, and the D, which I mentioned. There's also potential service enhancements to the CRX, which is the Go Triangle express route that connects to Raleigh. And then we have included projects that were identified in Orange County Public Transit Plan for the Cedar Grove and White Cross connectors. And that's really getting into some of the less populated parts of the county. So providing that access for more folks who may not currently have access to service. And then extending and perhaps enhancing that mobility on demand program that's already underway in Orange County, which provides a you know, as needed transit service for a fee to folks who are not within proximity of a transit route. Anything else about the scenarios?
I think I just want to add the things that really stand out as differentiating these things in terms of what makes them much more coverage oriented or much more ridership oriented in terms of the costs of things relative to one versus the other. is the scenario B, the more coverage-oriented scenario, that mobility on demand service is extended to 7 days a week across the county geographically, which is quite expensive. That's more than $1 million. It's almost $1.5 million a year in the out years when you inflate the costs to what it is in the future. So that's a very expensive thing to do, but it literally provides coverage for the entire county. Sorry. Scenario A, both scenarios have the improvements in frequency on 15501. Scenario A includes significant improvement in frequency on NC54 regional connected corridor, which is certainly on a similar cost level as the mobility on demand service across the county. So that's kind of the big trade when you're thinking about a more coverage oriented thing versus more ridership oriented thing. The regional, more frequent connection from Chapel Hill to Raleigh in the ridership, for example, versus the mobility on demand across the county. That's one of the big cost differences, comparatively speaking, between the two. There's obviously some more details here in terms of the evening and weekend service. Just point out that we know from experience across the country that evening and weekend service is a really important thing for lower income workers who tend to work non-traditional shifts. And those folks are folks who, if they can rely on transit to get where they're going, will make a lot of trips on transit. And that's why that's a really high ridership relative cost investment to make.
Scott, can I ask a question? Given our earlier values discussion, who is best served by that countywide on-demand service? Who actually uses that? What's that typical profile of a transit user?
Well, I might have to actually throw that question to county staff about who are the primary users of the pilot program. But I do know from experience in other places that those sorts of on-demand services, the design of those services are, we call it on demand, but it's not like Uber. You've got to call ahead, you've got to make an appointment often, or there may be a significant wait. So it's not geared towards a higher end market, sort of high income person. It's geared towards folks who don't really have any other options, who, if they didn't have that service, the only thing they might be able to do is call on a friend or call on family to get them to the doctor. And so the typical profile of someone who might be using that service is generally a lower income, maybe an older senior, or someone who can't drive physically for some reason, and therefore really would rely on that service to get to shopping, to get to medical appointments, and so on.
It also gets the other is what are they using it for? So, for example, if they're using it to go to the doctor or they're using it to go to work, then expanding it for Saturdays and Sundays may not make a whole heck of a lot of sense, because doctors and jobs not only but primarily weekday activities. So better understanding both who uses it and what they're using it for, I think would certainly inform a decision about where and how you might expand it.
Yeah, so I think this can get into the details of how you want to structure that kind of a program. Do you want to structure it around focusing on access to jobs, access to medical appointments and things like that, which would gear you in the direction of a 5-day-a-week type service? Or do you want to gear it in the direction of everyone deserves to have access to the entire region of the county all the time, cultural events on Saturdays and Sundays and things like that, as part of a coverage goal, then you might lead you in the direction of a 7-day-a-week service, with the understanding that it's going to have a relatively high cost per trip. These kinds of services you're talking about costs per trip to $20 to $40 per trip, for example. Relatively speaking, your fixed route services in high ridership areas are more like $4 or $5 per trip.
And to your earlier point about people working on non-traditional hours, there may well be some workers in the county who work on weekends.
Oh, yeah.
Not just recreation.
I mean, obviously, your hospital workers often have to work weekends. They work late shifts. Retail workers, your busiest days are Saturdays and Sundays. Restaurant workers, quite busy on weekends. Yeah. So access to jobs is absolutely not just about the 5-day-a-week thing.
It's better to clarify the typically, again, think about national practice here. The on-demand services are not typically utilized for the daily job commute, correct?
I mean, it's far less likely you're going to get someone who does, you know, a 5-day-a-week trip commuting to work with that kind of a service. Because the waits can be so long, because it can be, you know, unreliable. You may have to share a trip. You don't know exactly how long your commute's really going to be on that kind of a service. So yeah, it does. The market for those services tends not to be, you know, even low wage workers. It's relatively unlikely. I mean, it's not impossible. Some people will rely on it, but it's more likely to be a senior. It's more likely to be someone who physically can't drive anymore.
And it's a less frequent trip.
Yeah.
Those services match well with the once one day a week to the grocery store, doctor's appointment, or if my bus didn't show, or I've got to get to work and I don't have my car for a day, like those sorts of things. But it's not the daily commute trip.
It's a lot like the paratransit service.
Yeah, I mean, a paratransit rider, you know, profile is going to have a lot of similarity to the profile of someone using that kind of a service. Yeah, not 100%, but a similarity.
Yeah, we got just real quick. Someone from the chat, Mr. Dio Letman, who's the director of Orange County Transit Services, says so far our mobility on-demand service riders run the gamut of the population. However, our lower income and retail workers have used it to get home in a last mile situation.
For the last mile, okay.
In many instances.
Yeah.
All right, good to know. So this is a chart that I think y'all have seen before. And, you know, this was sort of the first time we tried to connect the scenarios to some of the values or priorities that we had heard through discussions, conversations, meetings that we've had with you all, with the public, transit service providers. So, you know, just sort of going down this list, and then I think what we'll do is pause and see what we're missing. But, you know, one thing that was that we heard was that there was, you know, a desire perhaps to invest in routes that are, you know, more utilized, around more people, supporting those higher ridership goals. So, you know, that's really falls into sort of the bucket of scenario A. The next thing is, you know, that geographic equity. How do we kind of make sure that we're serving all folks to give everyone an opportunity to use transit if needed? That one really is better reflected by scenario B. Investing in transit service that operates longer hours, more days per week. That was one of the primary things that we heard that came out of that first round of public engagement. That was by far one of it was by far the most common response when asked how transit could be enhanced in Orange County. It was, you know, being able to use it later or earlier and on the weekends. And that one, you know, the projects that were included in scenario A really do better sort of meet that priority. One thing that, you know, we heard a lot from you all, policymakers, and also transit service providers was, you know, making sure we were looking for ways to enhance the regional connections for commuters, particularly to help to solve the gap left by the discontinuation of the light rail. As mentioned, you know, the 15501 enhanced service is in both of those scenarios. So that was something that, you know, seemed important. So we tried to make sure that we addressed it in both of those options. And then the last one, I think, goes back to, Michael, your point that we talked about when we started back up here, you know, thinking about ways to leave room for future investments. And then also, you know, ensuring that there's financial sustainability. I think that was, you know, an issue that arose with the light rail. There were folks who were concerned that it was not financially sustainable. But, you know, we want to be able to build into both of these scenarios options for holding on to something, right, to make sure that you can leverage that funding for potential future capital investments or joint projects, perhaps that are regional in nature. So, you know, both of the scenarios do, to a degree, and, you know, this is a point that can be discussed for sure, how much, right, we want to kind of hold on to leave some room and flexibility for potential larger projects. So we'll stop talking about the scenarios, and I think let you do a little feedback, and I'm going to let Kate facilitate that conversation. Pass you the Sharpie. You got your own.
So I guess broadly speaking, given everything we've talked about today so far, what's missing in these scenarios at all? Like, are there specific routes? Is there a specific goal related to coverage and or frequency based on what you know that's in them right now? Are there some missing pieces?
Well, I'm going to go back to Jen's goals and values.
Okay.
This looks like a list of goals.
I'm sorry.
The values reflected in scenarios.
Oh, right.
On the screen.
On the screen, right.
Yeah.
No, I think you're totally right.
Yeah,
Yep. Right now, that's a set of, and that's what I think we were huddling around earlier, which is what we really want to do is take these scenarios and now evaluate them against this list, right? And we haven't done that yet. So that's a to-do for sure. But if we could maybe attempt to think about these values. Let me put the values back up. If you think about these values and you think about the two scenarios as they currently stand, let's just go through it. When we think about equity, scenario A and scenario B, is there anything missing that would improve the equity kind of dynamics in those scenarios, or are they equal?
I think we're missing some essential information.
Okay.
Because you've laid out some, broad brush scenarios, and that's fine. But the underlying data or rationale for those specific investments is, I'm not saying the work wasn't done, but at least we haven't been, it hasn't been made visible. So take environmental sustainability, right? Which of these replaces more car trips? I don't know. Equity, well, which of these scenarios will serve more minority populations, for example, or more economically disadvantaged folks? I don't know. So I really don't have enough information at this point to really give intelligent answers to whether they do or they don't meet our values.
And that's totally fair. And I think that's something that we kind of going through this value exercise today, we've now got a new set of metrics that we want to be able to feed back to you all. So given that, let's not try and think about the current scenarios against these new values that we just clarified. Rather, are there any specifics within the scenarios that, in terms of, again, corridors, geographies not being served, any more generically or more specific projects that you all have in the back of your minds that you're not seeing? Like, is there anything specific that doesn't get reflected? Yes.
I have a question just for the regional connections for our commuters. Are we thinking Wake, Durham, Orange, or are we kind of more focused on the Durham, Orange because of the light rail? Even though the light rail, even though it failed, we were focusing on Durham and Orange County. Is that what we're meaning with the regional connections for the commuters? And also, so you're asking for a higher level of specificity potentially as far as, so are we getting down to like specific areas in our communities? Is that what you're talking about? So that's like a two-part question. Sorry if it runs together.
Maybe, I think I'll try to tackle part one and then Peter. Greg. What's that, Greg?
No, I couldn't hear it as well. I think the speakers are coming out that way. That's fine.
Okay.
I'll just come up here when I want to hear.
Well, let me restate it, or if you don't mind. The question is, when we talk about regional connections, what travel shuttle are we really talking about, right? That's one.
I think we're thinking about Orange, Durham, and Wake.
Okay.
And the scenarios, I think, do reflect that both the both the coverage and the ridership-oriented scenarios do make regional connections both to Durham and to Wake. And improve. Yeah.
Could I jump in real quickly and just ask about Alamance County? Because we are between the triangle, and part is coming from the west, and there's a major connection there for people coming as far as Greensboro, Winston-Salem. So leaving Alamance County out of the equation, I think, is a mistake.
And Chatham, I mean, we know Chatham Park, Chatham is growing, parts of that, certainly growing much faster than Oranges. And, I know from, having conversations with UNC, they see the West Alamance, West, the sort of the West 54 corridor as really essential to, as where they're drawing their employees from. And
well, I think so one of the things that stands out when we're thinking about the regional connections is in terms of just the quantity of trips that you might capture is just so much higher between Orange and Durham and Orange and Wake than it is between anywhere else. When you look at the total trip making activity and then the distances you have to cover, a fundamental aspect of thinking about the potential for transit ridership is when you've got to cover a really long distance, the ridership relative to cost, we're always thinking about particularly operating costs because that's eternal. You're going to have to pay for that every year to run that service. And if you're going a really long distance, if it's a 2-hour one-way trip, for example, that's going to cost you a lot per trip to run. And when you look at the RCO report and you see, for example, the potential commute trips between to, for example, Chapel Hill UNC hospitals, the lines connecting different potential origins are incredibly thick between Orange County and Durham and Orange. They're much thinner.
I can tell you that the commute between Devon and Durham, or the commute between Devon and Chapel Hill, is shorter than many commutes between Durham and Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I think what we're saying, and I think what we're hearing from you all is that the scenarios need to very clearly quantify when we say the regional connections, and we're pretty sure the data's there. We need to show that and kind of feed it back to you all and say, because there's a question, who are we serving in the region and why? And I think that's something that, it sounds like there's concern that there may be areas where that commute trip and that travel shed has actually increased and grown in the last several years, and we're not capturing it. So that's a data check that we need to look at.
That's exactly my concern. Yeah. And I also wonder if the ridership is low because of limited numbers of the times. If it's only running in peak hours, I think that we're missing a lot of potential ridership in those areas. And I don't mean to be a thorn in the orange.
No,
it's just I feel very strongly about advocating for the western part of the county.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, I think with this, again, this whole values discussion, regional connection, this is all about jobs. And so we need to better understand kind of those origins and destinations. That's the language we use, right? Where are people living and where are they trying to get to? And if we're prioritizing kind of that job access, I think we've got the data, we can kind of report back on that and give you all kind of a relative comparison of the different parts in terms of the desire lines for where people live and where they work.
And so I'm sorry. Is somebody else talking? I can't hardly hear.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Barbara. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Go ahead, Michael.
I think we can think more creatively about collaboration. So just as in the Orange County Transit Plan, a lot of the things we're planning on are done by or in collaboration with Triangle, for example. We're not looking only at Orange County transit providers. And so there may be opportunities, for example, in addressing some of Patty's concerns, if we could work with PART and do, work with them in ways that would allow them and us to better service, or think about collaborating with Chatham in ways that, might result in some joint funding. So I think that, we have to think, and again, it may not happen in the next few years, I get that, money is constrained, but but we have to start opening up that box of possibilities so that we're starting to point in that direction. What can we, if we believe, and I believe that getting folks in from certain parts of Alamance is important, then, yeah, I don't know that having, Go Triangle is actually prohibited by law right now from going more than 10 miles into Alamance. Chapel Hill Transit ain't going. So therefore, we have to think more creatively about who might be able to help us meet that need. Same thing with Chatham.
Yeah, no, I think you're bringing up an excellent point, which is, again, I think what we want to do is identify, again, this larger, better understanding of what the ultimate needs are, and then come back and start to say, okay, how do we meet those needs? And so one of the big needs that we're now identifying right now is this whole kind of regional connections dynamic, which to me gets back to the jobs value dynamic. And so we just want to make sure we've got the data, and that we, at least at a minimum, have a map that starts to show those desire lines, so that in this ultimate plan, that's documented. And then that becomes the way you start the conversation about a potential partnering to solve for that, right? Okay. All right, so Barbara, I think you had an additional, I want to go back. We talked about regional connections, but then you also asked a question about, do we want some specifics in terms of geographies served? And I think the answer is yes. Knowing that, we've got kind of this geographic coverage model in scenario B, I guess the other thing is, are there, whether it's a specific neighborhood / downtown / whatever it is that's not being served, or it's a new growing area that's not being served, or if it's a corridor that in your brain, you're like, absolutely, we have to have transit in that corridor. Are there any specifics geographically that you guys want to kind of speak to right now that isn't getting reflected in the current scenarios?
Yeah, that was my question. So it's like, you want us to think about drilling down just a little bit more specific areas.
If we can get any additional geographic drill down, that would be great. And if you don't, that's okay too, but we just want to know, was there something that just didn't get addressed, or you're not seeing on the map, that sort of thing?
I'd like to see the Highway 54 corridor extended farther to the west. It looks like it's only going about halfway through the county, not all the way out to perhaps Seven Oaks Road, or other connections for the folks from Grant that are coming towards Chapel Hill. I'm not sure if that's an expansion of an existing route, and pardon me for not knowing the answer to that question.
So I think you're responding to the 54 corridor in scenario B that's highlighted. Yeah. So that is that shown in scenario B. That would be a new service that doesn't exist today, from the short range transit plan recommendations, I believe, from OCPT, to have a community oriented service out to White Cross. Getting all the way to Graham would probably be 2 to 3 times as much because it's a long distance.
In those scenarios, that's where we could talk with Park. Maybe they would bring them partway, be efficient with their service and return. Like, I know we don't like to make transfers, but that might be an opportunity where rural residents could, get a ride, maybe even mobility on demand to that location, and then have an efficient transit system taking it.
The other thing that we talked about, I don't remember how it came up, but the notion of park and rock, I know it came up in the MPO conversations about or West Corridor study, was the notion of investing in a parking lot somewhere in the western part of Warren. So, again, commuters could travel on the, people could drive their cars on the less crowded parts of 54 and then pick up a bus. Some, I don't know exactly where you want to put it, but, some kind of a hybrid, but starting to look at, the park and ride options.
My understanding is that the Burlington Graham NPO is financing a Go Triangle study for a park and ride in Meta that's supposed to start this fall. And it would probably be closer to the 8540 corridor, but it could certainly be located in such a way that it serves the north-south route also to get down to 54.
Or you know, again, parking right on needs, you know, again, so I don't know, but again, I have no answers to questions, but, you know, look at what perhaps in the White Cross or someplace around, you know, in the far western part of Orange.
And maybe what we're doing here is talking about another possible collaboration.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Village, Brandon, and the Triangle, whatever your other one is. Durham, Chapel Hill.
But yeah, but importantly, I think we're also keen in on geography is not being served right now with these scenarios. And that's Western, and that's good. No, that's what I'm saying. We want to hear that, right? We want to say, and whether that's a park and ride solution or we don't know what the solution is, but we know that's a geography that is growing and we want to see something happening for. Okay. Any other geographies / corridors that you think are worthy of, again, identifying as a need based on the values that we've all talked about kind of for the county?
I'm not sure if this is the right time to mention this, but I might be gone before the right time is. But we haven't talked at all about the Hillsborough train station and its need to be connected to transit. You know, the town owns a lot of land at that property. And we have not yet had any in-depth discussions about what will go there other than the train station with a building that serves some purpose for the town. But it's 22 acres, so there's going to be other stuff there. And then also, we've got a big new neighborhood, Collins Ridge, which is 900 dwelling units that isn't built out yet, but it's being, it's some of those certificates of occupancy are coming up. So there's just going to be more people in that spot. I mean, it is along identified corridors, but having the actual train station connected is going to be important.
So that's kind of a new development node, if you will.
Yeah.
And it served a historic function in that way. So yeah, okay. Any others?
So, and I'm sorry, it's not served. There's no historic function. This is a new train station that will be built. It hasn't been built yet, but we have to have it built within 5 years.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now.
Yeah, so I was also thinking generally about the Hillsborough to Chapel Hill route, and I know that there's minimal bus service. What a good triangle bus.
420.
Yeah. I think that needs to be more frequent, and I know what Michael was saying about protecting the town.
I'm sorry, the second one. So we've got Hillsborough and Durham.
86, but going all the way down below Southern Village into at least to the border.
There used to be a bus that Chatham paid for, and they stopped paying, so we stopped doing it.
So again, the idea of more collaboration. Collaboration with town.
Michael, does the MPO still have on their docket the US 70 study that's supposed to be looking at that connection between Hillsborough and Durham? Okay.
And this is just a question of my eyes are getting bad, but I don't go see the eye doctor until next week. Is this light blue line? I just can't read these letters. Is this the ODX and scenario B? The light blue?
Yeah, scenario B, the light blue line along I-85 is improved. Make sure I specify exactly what it means, but it is an improvement to the ODX frequency of service.
Okay, great.
And that's included coverage. And I think that relates a little bit to maybe something I didn't say before about the regional connections. There's regional connections in both that connect to Durham and Raleigh, but they are organized a little differently. In the ridership concept, they are more about frequent services on those two key corridors, really from Chapel Hill along the major corridors where you have a lot of activity along the way, like south on 54 and so on. Versus in the more coverage-oriented concept, it is a broader spectrum of less frequent services connecting to your regional partners across larger parts of the county. So,
there's regional connectivity in both of them, and then it's organized in one way that in a more ridership oriented, high frequency way, and then the other in a more coverage oriented way where you're spreading those regional connectivities more broadly.
Okay. Any other geographies?
Yeah,
Slash
that's
borders?
a question. It's as we've thought about it, it's particularly relevant to the 805 expansion, which is an A but not B. I mean, RTP is undergoing its own kind of transformation, and they're developing a hub and developing housing, and I know they have talks about developing their own. Right now RTP is looking at transit desert, right? One of the reasons why it's very hard to serve. Does our plan align, particularly scenario A? I haven't really tried to figure out all the details. Does it align well, or is it supportive of and supported by what RTP is trying to do in terms of creating their new density and their new hub? Because it seems like if we're going to make any investments toward the east, then it really ought to align with what RTP's plans are, because that's a major job generator and will soon be potentially a housing generator.
And by RTP, you mean the actual developer institution of the park itself?
Yeah,
right.
Well,
Yeah.
RTP, right there, the Art Research Triangle Foundation, had this, very ambitious plan to develop a, basically converted from what was this, completely spread out, start creating a central focus. I think they call that the hub, right?
I think at a high altitude level, I can't really specify how closely aligned it is in the long term with, where the route would go within the park, where they're doing development, because we haven't quite gotten to that level to go. But I think at a high altitude level, it's a major employment center. They are planning on significant redevelopment to make it more than just an employment center long term, as you say, and a more frequent connection between your densest, most active employment center and town center, Chapel Hill, and that facility would be part of an important regional connectivity long term that would likely generate higher ridership. It's obviously not an incredibly high all-day ridership generator right now because it's so office employment focused. But as you say,
it's changing.
Yeah, it's changing, and in the long term, that would be supportive of that because you'd have a more frequent all-day, all-weekend connection to that place from Chapel Hill.
And not only that, but it becomes more suitable for public transit, because now if something magically took you to someplace in RTP, you can't get anywhere else, right? Because there's no transit infrastructure in RTP. But as it becomes more centralized and they can invest in their own transit infrastructure, then making connections there becomes more feasible and more productive.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay. Any other geographies? Places or corridors?
Well, again, there's probably only just one of several examples that we can think of that the connection to UNC, say, from the green track would be a connector that serves the equity value, the racial equity value. That's not, somewhere between high frequency. That's a place where I would like to see high frequency, even though the ridership numbers, the population numbers might not net out ideally for that. So that would be like neither one or the other.
And it also actually seems we currently have some better than it used to be, still not great service to Rogers Road, right? And it's really combining the Rogers Road neighborhood and the beat tracks, but it may also be thinking creatively about getting more granular about what their needs are. So it may be high frequency, but only for time, right?
Right.
Really, is it again, if we're going to provide service there, is it job oriented service, educational oriented service? And again, we're not going to do that necessarily in this transit plan, but really get very granular so that we deploy our resources in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, and I think if we go back to, again, now the clarity we have with values, and we've got the data, we can kind of go through and say, okay, if we here's where some of those key equity opportunities are, and here's what the need is, and then kind of verify, well, what options do we have to serve that need and what makes sense. So it sounds like there's just some checking off of, again, what we've already got against these values to really substantiate kind of what we've got and maybe what's missing. Okay. All right. We are at another stopping point, and I think what we want to do actually is kind of, I think this has been a good discussion of the scenarios. You know, we've talked about our values. We would like to have a conversation about the funding so that everybody understands kind of the funding pots, as well as what some of maybe future funding pots could be. So I say we do another 15-minute break, then we talk about funding for 30 minutes, and then we talk about next steps.
But I think what we're leaving out here, so right now what we discussed is the two scenarios as they are. And we haven't really had a conversation about sort of some big picture ads for the decade of the 2030s. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't have that conversation today.
Gotcha. Okay.
We've done, I think, a job of understanding, perhaps refining what we've already done. But if we're really starting to talk about a broader vision and more aspirational, then I think we need to have some kind of a conversation about what is it we aspire to.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and I should have said we do want to come back to what we just talked about. So that's a good clarifier. All right, so let's take a 15-minute break. We'll have a shorter financial discussion just so we all know kind of what's in play, and then maybe what some additional financial strategies could look like, just so we kind of have that all. Then we'll circle back and talk about, okay, what's our aspirational vision plan, and then we'll talk next steps. All right. Okay. Back at noon.
Okay. We're all back. So we want to just do a quick overview reminder on what the finances situation looks like of the current funding. It's not. There we go. As a reminder, the governance and the structure of the financing here is built on a lot of state law, of course, about what your tax sources are and how they flow. Article 43 in particular, talking about the half-cent sales tax, which we'll mention in a moment, is the largest source. And the way that functions is that we have to develop this plan, as we talked about, to implement how you spend those dollars, and has been done before in the past. The 2017 plan assumed about 10% of federal funding for expansion of bus services. We know that is perhaps a bit of rosy forecast for the future. 44% of federal funding for capital projects, which was a significant reduction from what was assumed in 2012. And we'll talk a little more about federal funding in the future. And assumed no state funding available for capital projects in the future. We know that state funding is pretty unreliable going forward. Federal funding for operations is relatively limited. Federal funding for capital can be available, but it is also very competitive, as we'll talk about in just a moment. When we look at that local funding, what dollars do you have? You have the four sources: Article 43, the half-cent sales tax, which is the largest generator of your funding amongst the four items. The vehicle rental tax, the $3 and then the $7 vehicle registration fees. And it's important to point out that I believe it's only the $3 that you can use to help pay for existing or pre-existing services and the increased cost of those. All the rest of these are required to be spent on some kind of improvement or expansion of new services or enhancement of pre-existing services, not to replace the funding of existing things that are pre-existing services. For the transit planning projects. Yeah.
Remember, Chapel Hill is putting in over $5 million in Chapel Hill Transit. There's some other tax. Colorado is paying for the transit. University. So
This is about what's in the funding that we're working on allocating through this process, as opposed to what is there. Because yes, you're right. Chapel Hill, UNC are putting in significant chunks of annual funding to operate their systems. The county transit plan funding to support their services is a relatively small portion of their annual budget.
So I'm going to ask a question to clarify what you said about new versus, existing versus new. Mm-hmm. Where would fit in extra money to expand the frequency? Is that expansion or is that old? That's
an improvement to service, which would qualify for funding from any of these sources. So it's the intention is that these monies were not intended to replace the funding of things that existed before. So a 30-minute service that has been existing for years and years and years, the intention is that this money shouldn't go to replacing the funding for that service. But if you wanted to increase it to every 15-minute, then yes, you could fund that incremental increase out of any of these resources. So looking at the forecasts of revenue, this is the average annual forecast of how much revenue will be coming in each year, approximately for over 5-year periods, looking out to 2040. So at about $10.5 million a year over the next 5 fiscal years is the estimated revenues, increasing to about $11.5 million in the second half of this decade, then about $13.8 million in the beginning of the 2030s, and then almost $17 million in the second half of the 2030s. And then we look at expenses, basically things that are already programmed that we expect will continue to be funded. Things like there are administrative expenses that will obviously continue to be funded. And then there are things that you are already paying for, some OCPT services, the 420, some of which is paid for by the current transit plan. There are some CHT services that are currently paid for out of this plan, and we assume those will continue. So we carry those forward, plus there are some in the next 5-year capital things that are already programmed, like the train station in Hillsborough, that, for example, raise the costs in these first 5 years. So about $9.5 million is already effectively programmed per year over the next 5 years. And also vehicle replacements over time for the services that you're already funding are included here. So, so that when you look out over these fiscal years going forward, even when we get all the way out to 2040, things that are already programmed and we anticipate still being spent, you're talking about $7.5 million. So a good chunk is already programmed. And this is just a quick breakdown of those by types. A sizable portion of this is service and operation of existing service, of existing things that you're already funding that are on the street, and we expect to continue to be funded. You'll see in orange there the vehicle acquisition, which is also a thing that you fund. So any services that you are funding today, there's a vehicle acquisition over time, every 10 to 12 years, replacing vehicles for those services. So what's available when you take out the reserve funding? There's very little available funding for the next 5 fiscal years because there are so many programmed elements already there, capital funding in the next 5 years. And beginning in 2026 is when there is a significant increase in the availability funding. So about $4.8 million a year going forward from 2026. And then towards the end of this forecast period, 2036 to 2040 is when you see a significant increase in the available funding to about $8.8 million a year. So that's the big picture availability of funding within the county transit tax revenue. So are there any questions about these forecasts and predictions on the financial side? So one thing I want to just touch on quickly is that operating capital question again. And just thinking about it at a high level and coming back to that wall around your life I talked about earlier. The big picture, thinking about capital is often really, capital is the thing that enhances or makes possible the operation. So it's buying the vehicles. And significant capital investment is often about things like the speed and reliability of service. You know, BRT investments are in large part about increasing the speed of service or ensuring reliability of service, or capacity. The North-South BRT in large part is also about capacity of service. And so when we're thinking about capital investment, I always want to encourage people to think about each of these vehicles here on the screen. How do they contribute to the freedom and expanding those walls? Because that is what we really want to think about when we're thinking about that capital investment that you're making. And so the top right, that orange line vehicle from LA, it's about speed and reliability and capacity in that case. So where do you need larger vehicles because you have so much demand? The vehicles on the left side and the bottom and the middle there are about maximizing the frequency and speed of service because you have separation from all vehicular traffic because you're on aerial separated right away. When do you need that? You need that when you have extremely high demand, when you need extremely high frequencies, and you need much higher capacities. I always want to encourage people to think about at the high altitude level, what are the things that you're investing in on the capital side that will enhance freedom and mobility? Because that operating funding is what's really providing the service, and it's the thing that you need eternally in order to provide that mobility every year. And capital funding is that thing that can support better service. It can sometimes help you provide more service for your operating dollar. So for example, if you have a BRT or BRT-like service, you can potentially provide the same frequency with fewer vehicles and save yourself on operating. That assumes, though, that you're in a situation where a significant speed increase is possible. So what you're thinking about, what corridors can you significantly increase speed so that you might be able to reduce the number of vehicles you need? Where is that likely to be? And at a high level, I think we all need to think about what is the reality in a lot of Orange County. Yes, there's a lot of congestion at times, but how much does that actually delay your service? So how much might you actually be able to achieve in terms of, say, operating cost savings from a major capital investment? How much time might you actually be able to save in a speed increase? On a lot of corridors, it may not be much. You might make a major capital investment and ultimately not get a really big speed increase because the congestion is perhaps a very short period of time of the day, or it's not nearly as bad as it is in other parts of the region, for example. So it's always important to think about what is ultimately the bang for the buck you're getting there in that kind of a capital investment.
Could you just clarify, and this is more for folks that are not, when you say investment in speed, what you're really saying is that in order to improve speed for a transit vehicle, it's about getting its own dedicated lane, correct? Or getting it out of
congestion in some way. Yeah. So it may not be a dedicated lane for the entire 5 miles of the corridor, but it might be a queue jump lane, meaning a lane at an intersection where you have significant delay that might hold you back 2 or 3 minutes at a particular intersection. It can be small scale things like that across a corridor, as opposed to one dedicated lane the entire length of the corridor. Traffic signal priority, yeah. There's a whole range of tools there, particularly when we're talking about surface transit buses, which is primarily what we're thinking about here because that's the primary tool we have.
And what you're saying, though, is that what we always have to be mindful of is the savings and speed, which again, you're trying to keep the transit vehicle as competitive with that car trip as possible. And therefore you want the times, for a person to get from point A to point B, if it's competitive with the auto, I'm more likely to want to take that trip. But that if it's only a 5-minute improvement, is that really worth the $30 million or whatever that capital is going to be? So you're always balancing that investment against speed improvement, right?
And also, what is the alternative of investing that in improved operating, particularly frequency, that might save the same amount of waiting time for that trip? If you improve a service from every 30 minutes to every 15 minutes, your average waiting time drops from 15 minutes to 7.5 minutes. So you've automatically saved 7.5 minutes. Now you have to pay for that because you've doubled the operating cost of your service. But that's potentially more bang for your buck long term than saving 3 minutes of delay at an intersection with a significant multi-million-dollar investment in a queue jump or various other things. So that's the balancing you want to think about.
It's also perception. It's really interesting. A couple of years ago, there was the Richmond BRT, which actually wasn't that much of a BRT. But what was fascinating was, at least they believed, correctly or not, that there was prejudice against buses in Richmond. It was perceived that only poor people took buses, and that middle income of people didn't take buses. So they invested an amazing amount of money in their bus stops to create an impression of a higher quality of service. And it seems to have worked because their ridership has exceeded all of their projections. So I think there's also, as we think about some of these things, there are sort of psychological factors that also contribute to getting people to want to use public transit, that it may not be completely rational, but it's still important.
Right. What I wanted to add to that was, let's say you're the consumer here, and the difference between driving to work and riding the bus is, let's say it's a 10 or 15 minute on the bus. The other factor is you're not driving. And the other factor is, from the policy point of view, there's going to be a lot of people on that one bus and it's not all those cars going. So there may be reasons. So that's part of the equation too. Not just the frequency, but other factors.
Well, I think so an important point about that is your travel time relative to the auto is always important. There's some useful research out there about you can be competitive even if it takes 50% longer. You can compete because of that value of your time that you can actually spend doing what you want to do as opposed to driving. But relative to the thinking about the operating cost side of the equation, people really value flexibility. So having a reasonably frequent service, so they know, okay, if I have to leave in the middle of the day, I don't have to wait an hour because my service is only peak only or once an hour. Or if I have to work late, I know there's going to be service at 8 p.m. when I'm done with my report. And so that gets to the operating side of the equation of what really matters to folks in terms of the usefulness of service, which is why I keep going back to thinking about that wall around your life as a critical aspect of the ultimate usefulness of service. But thinking a little bit about the capital potential, what can you do? Federal capital grants are a possibility to think about. The major corridor improvements can be packaged into BRT-like packages where you could attempt to go after small starts or new starts funding, particularly small starts more likely. Those are for projects up to, for requesting up to $100 million in funding. Generally, you are limited to 50% federal portion. There's what's in. Very few projects get more than 50%. So, yeah. So the challenge, of course, of small starts and new starts is there's a very laborious process of getting into project development, meaning you need at least some reasonable pre-planning work to show that you have a project that might be viable. There is then a process working with the FTA, a study, analysis, environmental review, and so on, then getting projects through your MPO to ensure that everything is regionally planned and within the fiscally constrained metropolitan transportation plan. So it's a pretty laborious process that even the best projects can take 5 to 10 years at least to get through. And it is highly competitive. The other laborious part of the process is assessing all of the different factors that they weigh you against all of the other projects in the bucket for that year. And you also have to meet certain minimum levels of viability in terms of their rating of low, medium, high on the different factors, like mobility improvement, environmental benefits, and so on. So it is a process that you can use to try to leverage and maximize your capital investment, but it is also something that at this point, I don't really there's not a clear, significant project that's got enough pre-planning to say with a lot of certainty that we have something to put in right now, most likely in this plan. But it is something to explore for potential projects in the future. And I know 15501 is probably the highest corridor that would probably rise to that level of significance. But I just want to make sure everyone goes into the thinking about what it would take to get to that kind of a small start.
Remember, we already have the project in the queue that's been supported.
In SBRT. Yes. So, and that is pretty far along. Yes. But there's no additional things, I should say. Yes. So
I would just, let me exit. I think that's a very important slide, because this is about the aspirational for us to move to that next phase of funding beyond our transit tax. That's where we're going to have to bolster, whatever we're doing now that would support expansion in those criteria. There is what, since it's very competitive, what makes or breaks the ability for that additional funding. So as we look towards that next phase of development, we need to keep that in mind. That's something where we could get help from the federal government in some other areas where this might not rank highly. That's where we use local monies to, for those other projects that might not get the federal funding.
Any other questions on the funding outlook? It seems like you all understand foundationally, yes, there are these other buckets we can go after. And there's the other thing we didn't talk about, but I think maybe, Michael, you alluded to this, is let's get the aspirations on a piece of paper, because there is, and maybe this is what you were asking earlier, this region doesn't really function regionally in the sense of, you're doing your plan, but there's not a direct conversation happening right now into the shared resources for some of these joint routes. We know that's where you want to go eventually, but that's not been a big part of the conversation. But I guess that's another, I'd call it bucket of funding, which is the regional partnering that can be done to serve some of the desired aspirations, right? And so as we think about our
the challenge that we have as a triangle is there really is not a bucket of regional funding.
Right.
And that is the fundamental problem in a triangle. All funding for any transit project as of today starts at the county level, right?
Right, it's all local.
3 separate transit plans, 3 separate counties allocating their half cent and other monies, and there is in fact no regional bucket to go to, and that is part of the problem, because as a result of that, in each county, depending upon where they are at your point, there is this ongoing tension between meeting local needs and meeting regional needs and being part of it. And that, I think right now we felt probably most intensely in Durham, where they want to basically double the size of their bus service, go, and also are at least faced with, looking at participating in the commuter rail project with Wake and participating with Orange County in some replacement for light rail, whatever that ultimately comes to be. And I think, so one of the things that's going on is sort of background to all this is Triangle J and Triangle recently submitted a bill grant to the federal government to do a regional transit plan and start the conversation toward, getting regional funding, getting funds dedicated to regional needs rather than always competing with local needs.
Thank you for saying all that. Yeah, because I think that's an important challenge that you all have here in Orange County, but just in the region, is just that, we kind of recognize that there's not really a mechanism right now to pool those resources in the same kind of way other regions have done it. So, you all, as you're identifying these regional connections that benefit more than just Orange County, just keep remembering, okay, that means, yeah, we're going to have to find a way to partner to solve for that. It isn't just on us. And there is a lot of effort going on regionally to start to make that better, we hope, right?
No, yeah, I mean, we have, the political environment at the state level is not particularly to transit. In fact, I don't know what the final disposition will be, but there is at least a reasonable probability that the spot process, which allocates funding to all transportation projects across the state, will be deferred for another year. They did it once already, but we have a cap in the state of no more than 6% of total DOT expenditures to go to public transit.
I was going to mention when we were working on the 2012 plan, we were working from 2010 on, the landscape was starting to change 2010 on. We really did understand the impact of that. But the spot funding formulas, as you mentioned, different MPOs in different DOT divisions and how money is split in those DOT divisions. So we end up being competition against each other. Wayne County Campo versus DC, so there isn't a clear path forward. Maybe this Bill Grant will, how do we bridge those regional barriers, sub-regional barriers, because it does create some funding scenario difficulties. Absolutely.
Well, let's, we're not going to solve that part today, but I do want to kind of open it up for getting back to the aspirational vision plan. And unfortunately, I don't feel like we've got a good map to facilitate this conversation. So I don't know, Caroline, do we have a better visual, or is there anything that we could put up? Or, I mean, I think what we've got to do, we got a map up. I guess the few things that we identified already with the scenarios, I guess my question is, if we step all the way back and imagine these scenarios didn't exist, for the three of you, and Barbara, if you're still on the line here, what does that big picture aspiration actually look like? If you're thinking about Orange County 40, 50 years from now, and recognizing the likely continued growth, because all of the numbers show that you're not slowing down growth-wise, right? What is that system, maybe not where it goes, but are there specific aspirations you have in terms of maybe mode split, where you're saying, you know what, we want 10% of our population on a daily basis to be accessing their employment by transit, or do we talk about goals in that way? Or is there a more physical, we want to be sure we've got this kind of premium transit serving these kinds of corridors? So we can talk about it in any way you want, but are there some, we know what our values are now, given those values, what are some of the goals, big picture wise, that you have for this transit plan, or for not this transit plan, but for a transit vision for the county that we could start to articulate? And when I say vision is long term.
I think, we need to start by defining the major corridors, through which transit, public transit really makes the most sense, right? Where do we expect people have to get from and to, because I always, when I think about a transit plan, when I think about a vision, I see it as sort of a layer, right? You start, technically start, but you have big investments that tend to be longer distance, right? More expensive, like commuter rail, something like that, maybe a light rail. Then you have sort of, the next level down are things like a PRT. And then after that, you have your local bus service, and going forward, 30, 40 years out, God knows, kinds of little autonomous vehicles scurrying around. But, you know, and they have to be all connected, right? I mean, you know, it's like in computers, you know, the value of the network is proportional to the square of the number of the nodes. And so what you're really looking at is making sure that all of these various pieces connect to each other in a plan that, you know, that are mutually reinforcing. And, you know, but I think that's what we need to be thinking about. And then, you know, the big things, whether it's a commuter rail or a light rail or something we haven't invented yet, right? Maybe PRTs are developed by a regional agency, Go Triangle or somebody else. And then the local bus services, you know, developed by the local, you know, the more local transit authorities. But you need that, you know, sort of both, where do you want people to get from and to, what's the best way, what modes, whether, like I say, whether it's commuter rail or something else, what's the way to get them there? And generally speaking, you know, the farther the distance they have to travel, the more speed you need, because it's sort of the sweet spot. Nobody, you know, people don't want to stay on a public transit vehicle for more than about 30 to 45 minutes. So you're only, you know, as you increase your distance, you're looking at speed constraints, and then you're looking at modes. So if you want to go 60 miles an hour, you probably need commuter rail, or 80 miles an hour, or if you're going 35 miles an hour, local bus service probably works just fine, and you've got things in the middle.
I want to add something that may seem obvious, but needs to be said, and that is frequency. I have a notion that the ideal system would not have a single bus that did not come by less than 15 minutes apart, hopefully more frequent than that. I know we can't, that's probably, but that is aspirational, but I think for a system to really work that people are going to use, it has to be frequent.
But again, it depends on, like a commuter train, right? It doesn't need to run every 15 minutes, but your local bus does.
That's right.
You know, so it's understanding that, you know, like if you commuter rail someplace every half, whatever it is, may work just fine. And in some cases, you know, like when we look at the north-south BRT, given capacity and all sorts of things, at peak, we're looking at running out every 7.5 minutes.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about the DC, where I could walk down the street during rush hour in the morning, catch any number of buses because I came every 10 minutes, get to the metro station, and not have to worry about missing one bus because there was a note behind it for 7 minutes.
When it seems like the system is optimal when you don't hesitate not having a car.
Yeah.
That's like the ideal, right? We're like, okay, I you know, and I think what's been fascinating is the just that mindset. And once you make that step through that, you kind of know, well, that's when you know you've got a good transit. So that's an idealized. So one of the things, though, I guess, given kind of these things, you talked about, Michael, as you were talking, I started thinking about, you know, we do a lot of work to kind of analyze, you talked about the sweet spot of time and people's willingness. Well, we all do make these decisions where we live and what we do based on our travel budget. We really do. You know, we say, okay, it's worth it for me to live way out here, even though that's going to add to my daily travel budget, because I'm willing to sacrifice that in order to live in a less expensive home. Or
when you say travel budget, you mean time or money?
Time.
Yeah,
time.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you can do is, you know, we can again, if we're thinking about how do you develop this vision plan, you start to look at where are the corridors that are transit ready already, but then where's the future growth going? And then you kind of start to look at those contours, which I think Scudder put up a map earlier today in terms of what is the travel times, or what are the travel times across the county by mode. And you can even drill down to talk about walking modes, biking modes, and just really starting to better understand what's the multimodal set of opportunities in our county today, and then what does that look like in the future. And I think what you're calling for, or what we're hearing, is that getting to a system level of frequency of every 15 minutes, making sure that we've got on a map all of the corridors that we would
I would say are either existing or future will be suitable for transit. And the thing about being suitable for transit is that there are these kind of minimum density and intensity numbers you want to try and hit. I think we've got all that data, so I don't think it would be hard to start just putting those lines on the map potentially.
It's also the intersection between land use and transportation. You can't do transportation planning in isolation, right? You know, I mean, one of the things we've seen at the MPO when we do, you know, we get this data every 4 or 5 years, when we do our, you know, MTP, is that when we look at the alternatives, land use decisions are more impactful on congestion than are transit investments. You get more, you know, if you really want to make sure that you don't have congestion, you will want, you get your land use right first, and then you could fill in with the transit. And so there are also, you know, there needs to be some connections, you know, as we think about whether it's an Orange County transit plan or the regional transit plan, you know, there's got to be, you know, a connection with land use, because if you keep building, you know, just bulldozing land, putting in single family homes, you'll never be suitable for good transit, right? And so you have to, you know, understand that. And the other thing, by the way, I'd like to add to that, because I think it's huge. It turns out to be more impactful than I would have believed in terms of getting people to ride public transit, is making it fare free. You know, and right now, I'm curious to see over the next year what the numbers look like. But when Chapel Hill Transit went fare free about 20 years ago, within 5 years, our ridership doubled. You know, we are now in the triangle, much to my enormous pleasure, fare free. The entire triangle is fare free right now. And it's going to be a very interesting experiment over the next year to see what happens to ridership. But it turns out that one of the single most important, and Kansas City has done, it did this before the pandemic, but one of the single most important things you can do to generate ridership is make fare free.
So that's a bold visionary goal, right? That basically you're saying that if we have this transit system in the perfect world, it actually could be fare free. And that's, again, a numbers thing that you can test. What's interesting is, you know, we've all talked about the financial constraints and different things like that, but in terms of the values, that was not something that you all put up there as a concern. And what I mean by that is, this seems to be the transit system, and maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but there seems to be enough support that this is an important public benefit that while costs matter, it doesn't need to be run like a business. There's a benefit here that needs to be provided. Is that a fair statement? Because I feel like that was one of your values, like run it like a business in terms of the transit system plan. And I think we're saying yes, but really we need, this is beneficial for the betterment of our community, and therefore that's not a big value in terms of a return on the investment in the same way that maybe other things.
I think there's
How I should not run like a business. How I do not run like a business.
That's right.
right, they're not.
Right.
No.
Exactly.
And I think there's two ways to think about that as you think about the fare free question. One is you can still think about it in business terms, in terms of what is bang for your buck in terms of ridership relative to cost, even if you don't have a fare. But of course, if you do, then you're also thinking in terms of fare box return as a kind of business oriented financial thing.
You know,
but
I sort of think exceptional, because to me, yeah, if you look at running it like a business, means you have to make a profit. Well, yeah, of course, nobody was trying to make a profit, right? But
very few transportation businesses make profits.
Yeah.
Highways certainly don't make, most highways don't make profits. Yeah.
So, but if you say running it like a business, mean that you run it efficiently, and that whatever transit you have, whatever your goals are, you run it the most efficient way possible, given what your goals are. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to look at it, right? So you can be fare free, but it means your buses are well maintained, you keep on schedule, you know, you don't, you know, your procurement procedures are not onerous, you know, those kinds of things. I think they're not, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. It's that whatever your goals are, you do is, once you've decided what your goals are, what your purpose is, who you're trying to serve, then you do that the best way you know how.
Right. So I think what we're saying there too, what you just described,
is more the notion that, and this is what you hear when we define what premium transit is and its attractiveness and it's serving the best way it can, it is run like a tightly well-owned machine. Like it's good, like you're proud of it, you can rely on it. It is a trustworthy and good service. So yeah, I would agree with that.
And I think that's the way any local government type thing should be run as well.
Exactly.
Public services should be offered efficiently and effectively for the best benefit for the taxpayer dollars that are being paid for it. And my vision also would be that this is a level thing where local municipalities are provided bicycle pedestrian access to points where they can get on any other kind of transportation to get to the regional transportation. Part should be interconnected with Go Triangle, should be connected with Orange County Transit, should be connected with Chapel Hill Transit, and anybody should be able to get to those facilities in a safe and efficient way. If that requires people to put in more sidewalks or greenways, I think that needs to be part of this picture as well. So it's basic infrastructure and public service that we're talking about.
If I could add something to the land use transportation integration piece of this, one of the things I did say before talking about that wall around your life is that wall around your life, you can expand people's opportunity without enlarging those bubbles through the land use. And that's a huge piece of people's freedom and opportunity. And you're absolutely right, that is an enormous part of the puzzle here. I would encourage you all to think about this as a long-term sort of iterative process. Your current development pattern is the pattern that's going to be 80 to 90% of what's there 20 or 30 years from now. And so let's plan a system that best meets your goals against that development pattern you have now, but being cognizant of where things are going to be growing over time. And then I strongly encourage you all as leaders of your communities to think very carefully then about what land use policies do you use then to reinforce the most useful transit corridors you have over time through your parking policies, your development policies, and everything else in your arsenal. And then in a few years, you come back and you re-up your transit plan as new things come through in your land use planning processes.
And I'll just add to that, to your point, every transit trip starts as a walking trip.
Yep.
So, you know, how our communities are designed has a huge impact on this and all of those sorts of things. And it's also, I think, what we're saying is that the land use side of this, it is as much about, you know, thinking about kind of creating those compact walkable places that can be transit served, but it's also about then those folks living in those compact walkable places don't actually have to go very far for many of their trips. So all of a sudden you're taking some of those longer distance trips off of the roadways because people can, you know, walk to the grocery store or to dinner or those sorts of things while they may still have to take transit to commute. At least within their little neighborhood, they're not driving as much. So all of those are good things. And I want to ask a question about that, which is if you all move forward with a transit vision plan, how do you best capture the land use vision that goes with that? And has that, I know you've got a comprehensive plan, you know, you've got, but has there been a visioning exercise to really beg the question, how do we want to grow? And how then does our transportation system to support that growth kind of reinforce that?
Well, actually, I meant to bring the big document that it's a sad document because it was the one that was produced to go along with the library plan. And it was all these beautiful diagrams.
Transit-oriented development?
Yes, for all the stops that would be along the way. So here we're not designing new corridors like that plan essentially did, but it's more about redevelopment than development, but we definitely should be thinking that way. Right.
And part of the challenge is, remember that while we may be able ultimately to do regional transportation planning, land use is still probably one of the most local functions we have in every single town and village and county does its own land use plan. So that really represents a big challenge. And then to Scudder's point, You know, if I look at Chapel Hill, you know, 80 to 90% of our town is single family homes with cul-de-sacs, and, you know, and they ain't going away. And so, you know, yes, you know, we in Chapel Hill at least are, you know, really trying to focus development along our transit corridors, but that's still, certainly over the next 10 or 20 years, will still be a relatively small fraction of our population living there. And one of the challenges, you know, that we face with Chapel Hill and Carver, with Chapel Hill Transit, is our town is, you know, designed absolutely horribly for transit. You know, you can't find a straight street anywhere. You know.
Well, I'll tell you, we designed a pretty good transit system for Delta, where you can't find a straight street.
Yeah.
And things dead end randomly. Yeah. It's possible. It's hard, but it's possible.
So it does as well as it's ever going to.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But I will say, I think one of the things, and so I'm in Arlington, Virginia, so I'm part of that kind of DC transit system network. But the one thing I will tout that Arlington did 50 years ago now is they too were a built-out suburb. And they basically said, okay, we don't want to stop growing. So we are now going to change our policy to basically funnel all of our future growth into what will be these high capacity transit corridors. So they accommodated, I think the numbers or something, I won't get it right, but like 33% of the growth over the last 4 years has been accommodated, like 3% of the land or something like that. And you all could take that on as a vision and say, yeah, we're not changing what's on the ground today in terms of all those subdivisions, but anything new, we could be a lot more aggressive about saying, we're gonna locate those new homes, those new jobs in these high capacity corridors that we know can serve the transit over time. So getting back to how does the land use part of this conversation happen? And is that another kind of planning exercise that might be helpful to go through? Do you all feel that that's necessary to get you to a transit vision, or do you feel like the land use side of it is well planned already? Or are they kind of in their own two little silos right now?
I think that we have very different visions, not visions, but I think that the Chapel Hill vision on transit and acceptance of transit is probably very different from what I'm finding in Alamance or
Sure.
And even on a political level, there is not much will to make that sort of investment in land use planning. I think Devon tries, but we have an ETJ that is controlled in part by Alamance County, and there are still a lot of folks who want as big a lot as they possibly can get, and there's a sidewalk, they don't want a sidewalk in front of their yard. So I think that there's a political aspect to this, that all of the planning in the world from Orange County is not going to have that significant impact on some of the areas outside of Orange County. I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I love the idea of compact neighborhoods and walkable neighborhoods and village stores and that sort of thing, but there's still a segment of our society that is addicted to driving a car and having two cars in their driveway and driving everywhere they need to go. So we have to be able to we have to figure out how to convince those people of the value of transit.
Or you also can kind of say, well, that's not who we're going to serve when it comes to transit.
Yeah, I mean,
that's where you eventually kind of have to get to, which is to say, okay, there is a pattern that we can serve efficiently, and then there's a pattern we can't. And not that those folks are left behind, because they still benefit from the system overall, you know, providing services to other folks because it's more far off the road. So it's not that they aren't benefiting, it's just not a direct benefit for them to feel. So
yeah, I think that those are two really interconnected important points. One, you know, we talked earlier about access for all, but all may not want access. Mm-hmm. You know, yeah. There's a whole lot of people, you know, take a bus, are you crazy? You know, and so there is, you know, there's not a lot of point in trying to create bus service for people who, you know, are never going to take the bus. And the other, I think, is really important, and that was, you know, something we tried to get done with the light rail, was show the benefits of transit for people who don't use it. You know, because yeah, if they're on the bus, you can be in your car and have less traffic, or whatever. Or if you're environmentally concerned, you know, there's fewer pollutants, whatever, but there are, you know, there's a multitude of benefits to transit. And again, even with transit-oriented development, those kinds of things, even if you never take the bus, even if you don't live in transit-oriented development, they become nice places to go to because you make restaurants, you know, amenities, parks, whatever. And so there are benefits to people who are not directly participating.
Well, I think this is a conversation that definitely needs to be reinforced. I'm not sure the best way to do that or the timing of how to do that relative to this planning, but I think more of our colleagues need to understand it better. I think our constituents need to understand it better. A point I've tried to make on my board is ideally, I would like Orange County, when we invest in affordable housing, to limit that investment to transit ordinance. There's some pushback in that because there's all these other places that I'm looking at the future and thinking about what's responsible. And I'm not saying, you know, people should live in affordable houses that are in a deeply rural area. I'm just saying as a policy matter, I think it would be better to spend public money on, go back to the H+T, right? But there needs to be more buy-in on strategies like that.
I agree. I think there's a large educational component to this, and folks that are not interested in riding the bus really do need to be educated about the back to society as a whole. That they benefit from it.
You know, it's like fire, right? Your house probably isn't going to burn down, but nobody would ever suggest you don't take fire trucks, right? And it's the same, you know, I think we have to get to a place with transit where it's viewed in that same context. And that gets back to what I said about fare free as well. I mean, again, it's not free, it's being paid for by somebody, typically through some type of tax dollars, right? But it's the same with your fire. If you call, you know, you call your, you know, you call the police, you don't expect to get a bill. You know, I mean, and you know, move the thinking that transit is the same type of public good as these other community services are, rather than it's something that only some people use, only some people benefit from, and therefore they have, you know, an obligation to pay for it.
And that's going to be critical in Orange County, this kind of around this with the light rail. That's what we're talking about, because we're not going to run 15 minutes up.
All right. It is 12:51.
Promise to get you out of here by 1. I'd like to jump into the next discussion and just make sure we're all on the same page about what that looks like. And I think coming into this, we had a little bit of hope that there could be a way to roll out the current scenarios to the public just to get a test of, hey, are these meeting some of your goals and needs? But I'm not hearing that we have consensus.
So that's the bad one.
Let me come up here.
I'm not hearing that we have consensus to necessarily keep proceeding with these scenarios. Is that a fair statement? Okay. So what we need to do then, and I think what staff, you know, after hearing all this, is go back and do a little bit of a huddle to say, okay, if we're not rolling forward with these scenarios, what additional things can we do to start to move us a little bit more towards what I'm going to call the vision plan, where we've contextualized kind of the short-term versus this long-term vision, and what are some of the things that maybe we could start to put on paper, knowing that at the end of the day, you still need to produce something that directly shows how you're going to spend your tax revenue. So we know that's the end game, but what we're saying is we need to maybe pause, take a bigger step out, maybe expand a little bit what we want to look at. And then that may still lead us to, at the end of the day, something that looks similar to the scenarios in terms of the short term, but those are sitting within this larger vision of what long-term needs are, what long-term aspirations are for the county as a whole. Is that a good summary where we are?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. You know, think about it, time chunks, right? You know, we know that these plans, not by statute and by ILA, are required to be updated every 4 or 5 years anyway, right? So what we have to get right, so to speak, we really need to nail down what investments we're making over the next 4 or 5 or 6 years, because those are real investments, real money that will have real results, right? But we also know that, with the exception of, and then we have to start thinking about how much and where do we want to make planning investments that will inform actual expense decisions, for the decade of the 2030s. And so if we look at it that way, if we say today we want to build a BRT, a light rail, whatever, starting in 2032, we got plenty of time to change our mind, right? I mean, say those things today, and you may discover that next year or 2 years from now, the federal government goes out of transit business, or conversely, they double their spending, whatever. And we will adjust, in the next iteration of the plan, we can accommodate those ongoing changes. But I think, I wrote down something, it's a quote that I overused, but it's from, his first name, Burnham. Daniel Burnham, make no little plans, they have no magic experiments, blood probably themselves will not be realized. And so I think the more aspirational our plan is, the more we will get people to buy into it. And they will be motivated and say, wow, that's a future I can see myself living in, rather than, gee, there'll be some more buses on the street.
All good point. Okay. Well, I think we can come to a close. Brad, is there anything else?
Yeah, I think we got some good ideas of the framework is the corridors and what can be done in those corridors. There might be short-term things in those corridors and building towards a long-term vision. So I think we are getting some direction on that. You had mentioned earlier about, is there any long-term vision out there? And as you mentioned, the 2045 NTP and the 2050 NTP is starting to, it does some scenario developments about future employment, future populations. And I think one of the most important things about the vision that was mentioned today is that reinforcement of land use in those corridors. So as time proceeds, you're getting stronger and stronger providing a transit basis, and which ends up in funding, potential funding eventually. So I think you do have some good directions. This is a somewhat complex topic for people that have been around the NPO and in the cities. When we bring this out to the public, there'll be another challenge ahead, because there's, this is we need to reduce it to how that touches them, and how important it is for that big.
So also, can I ask, as we think about going forward, who's sort of going to do what, in terms of our, transit providers versus consultants there versus, planning staff? I've heard some concerns expressed retrospectively that our transit providers felt left out. They were only, given an opportunity to comment on the scenarios that were developed rather than participate in the development. And, clearly the most knowledgeable people we have in this community, that we're not paying extra for, are, our transit providers. So how do we make sure that we're getting them, and I would also put in a plug, because I think that, again, in the specific context of Orange County, at the end of the day, UNC and UNC Healthcare are one of, if not the biggest driver for transit, no pun intended. And so how do we incorporate them into scenario development rather than them trying to then modify something that looks like it's kind of already baked?
Yeah, I think, again, we've got to kind of, as your consultant team, kind of sit down with staff and say, okay, what is it that we think we're going to develop, and what does that scope look like, and then define the stakeholders and the engagement strategy to make it happen. And that's inclusive of kind of the technical expertise that exists in all of these agencies, but it's also some of those stakeholders. You know, how do they get in the room in addition to the policy board? So I think that's worthy of a revisiting as well, and we'll let staff help us to define that. And I mean, I think what you all are saying is that there is a desire to have this be a more collaborative process, which I have to say, kudos to all of us. This is my first engagement in person in a year, 18 months, I think, too. So I think we all are benefiting from, you know, we can have a dialogue, and it's so hard to do that in the virtual. So perhaps the next gathering is in person with the providing, you know, our providers or some of these other stakeholders. I think will go a long way. Do you agree?
Yes. Just pre-COVID, when after we had kind of the November 2019 launch, we need to update the plan. We were meeting every 2 weeks or so with all the local government and stakeholders from Triangle J it was wide open. We probably had 25 to 30 people that were meeting in person to talk about what should the update look like, or what should it cover, and how do we get data to support decisions. That wasn't, you know, that's not the direction, that was the scope of services that we, you know, began to formulate amongst staff, the transit providers, and local government representatives, both the planners for land use and the transit providers for the transit side. So I think we're ready to kick that back up again. You know, we have a good list, and we'll make sure that the stakeholders are you know, fully a full staffing of those stakeholders.
All right, it's officially 42 seconds after we said we would end. So I'm gonna call us to a close. Thanks to all of you that did hang on virtually. Hopefully we can all be in person next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.